Good evening. At this time, we're going to reconvene. Please stand for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, Mr. Smythe.
Mr. Gart?
Here.
Mr. Hall? Here. Mr. Krupa?
Here.
Ms. Mangan?
Here.
Mr. Nasser?
He has an excused absence.
Mr. Sanfilippo?
Here.
Ms. Stites? Here. Mr. Wondrak? Here. Mr. Adenizio?
Here. Thank you. All right. At this time, we will open public comment. Please come down.
Hi, I'm Betsy Cross. I live in Wall Township. Just wondering, when I walked in, Mr. Adenizio was giving an interview to the Coast Store about information that the public doesn't even know yet. So I don't think that's appropriate. Talking about some committee you set up and who's on it. Mentioned it was Chief of Police, 2 other people, a couple PTO moms, and all the principals. So I just don't think that's right. You know, if you have something to say, let the public know, and then the Coast Star can write about it. I didn't appreciate that standing here. I'm hoping we're looking to get an interim super in here and pretty quick. I would hope that maybe we could get in Stephanie Billmaker again. I know that 2 times was the limit, but maybe you can get her in and ask for an allowance to go past the 2 times. But we need somebody in here quick. Last Friday I drove by the office because my son's in the play. I'm going by a lot, and it looked like there was a meeting going on in the business office. I saw a bunch of cars there, and I was wondering what was going on. Was there a meeting, and who was there? How many people? Did you have quorum? What were you talking about? So the taxpayers aren't in the dark about everything while you're up here keeping everything to yourself, Mr. Adenizio. I put in some questions regarding the budget, and I, of course, did not get anything back. I'd like to know, of all the amounts that you budgeted last year, what you actually spent before you start budgeting new items for this year. Like I said, I'm very concerned. You budgeted $40,000 to replace the high school fire detectors, and you never replaced them. So we either needed them or we didn't need them. And if we didn't need them, why did you budget them, and where's the $40,000? You also budgeted for 3 doors at the intermediate school, Allenwood School, and Central School. And you only bought the Central School, which is disturbing. You budgeted $40,000 to paint the exterior West Belmar because it looks terrible. You didn't do that. You budgeted salary increases of $997,807. What are they going to be? Mr. Smythe keeps talking about having all the numbers, but he actually never gives the numbers. So what are the salary increases for last year, the 1920, as he budgeted $997, and I think he's way off. Everything on this list, the highlights of the 1920 budget, you should give us an update and tell us exactly what you did with the highlights of the 1920 budget before you start shoving numbers together for 2021. Had a big problem with that bid opening last week. You mentioned that Lurch did not bid, but they were not listed as a subcontractor, and William Cole signed his form of non-collusion affidavit. So you can't have that. Either you sign the non-collusion affidavit and you're not working with somebody, or you have to list them as a subcontractor. So maybe Mr. Smythe can go over, how did you do that? Because that would be illegal anywhere else. Why isn't it illegal here? So you were in the back room, Mr. Adenizio. You have the documents online. I have the bid specs, and I have the signed affidavits. So if you could go over that, I appreciate it. And it's too bad Mr. Nasser isn't here for the second week in a row, because he would understand that perfectly, and I'm sure Mr. Garth understands it, I'm sure Mr. Hall understands it. Could you let us know how much interest you're going to be receiving on bank funds in the bank this year? Since we were behind the 8 ball on that, we still have all these hidden bank fees that Mr. Smythe won't disclose. Ms. Mangan, I see you have some conflicts of interest on things and you're leaving an executive session. I'm wondering what your conflict is. I didn't know you had any conflict. So if you have somebody working in the district, maybe we could know, because you and Ralph had to leave in executive minutes. I see at the last meeting, I think it was the January 28th executive session, Ms. Dyer approved a grievance settlement, and the board then approved it in the back room. So where are you getting that money from? Because you're out of money in the lawsuit category.
Thank you, Ms. Cross. Your time is up.
So I would like, I do have a couple other things if I could have.
Your time is up, Ms. Cross. Thank you.
There's nobody else here, Mr. Adonisio.
We have a 5-minute rule. Thank you.
There's nobody else here. I'd like answers to my questions on the record tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's been very long since I've been up here smiling, so it's a good night. I would like to tell you folks about 2 programs that you would consider. The first one we haven't done since 2016.
Ms. Marr, I'm sorry, just state your name for the
Gail
record.
Marr,
Thank you.
WTEA president, 8th grade math teacher, resident of Wall.
Thank you.
So in 2016, we asked the students in 5th grade, 8th grade, and the seniors, if they chose to write an essay about a teacher that they remember. We thought we would pick just those grades, so it wasn't overwhelming. It was the year that students were leaving their building. And the question was, which teacher has had the greatest influence on your life? Specifically, what is it about the teacher or your interactions with the teacher that influenced you? What do you want other students to know about the teacher? So they wrote essays, and we read them through, and we selected a special essay from each building, and we asked them to come to a board meeting and read it to the teacher that they wrote it about. So we'd like to propose that they do that again. And I have this, and I'm going to hand this to Mr. Adonisio, and I gave one to Mrs. Gleason.
Okay, we have the other one. We passed it around, so
Okay.
we'll pass that one that way.
The other program, you've all heard for Teacher for a Day, where the teacher comes in, they get paired with a teacher, they prepare a lesson, and they feel like how it is being in front of those students all day. That is not what we're talking about now, but we will be coming back to talk about that a little down the road. The NJEA has a program, it's called Pitch It for an ESP. Secretaries, custodians, job coaches, drivers, paras, lunch aides, cafeteria workers, all fit into this program that they have. And what they suggest to the community, and I'm suggesting it to the board, to start it small, and if it's great, we could do it bigger, we could bring it out to more of the community next year, to shadow an ESP. Shadow them for half a day, shadow them for a whole day, and see what it's like being the secretary at the intermediate school or a job coach at the high school. And it would just give you folks an opportunity to see closely more what we're all about. And it doesn't have to be done all on the same day. It can be done with someone's schedule when it would work. And then we would pair off with somebody that wanted to show you around. So this is the other brochure that I'd like you to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will, I was on the board and when sorry, with the essay a couple years ago and thought it was a fantastic thing. And unfortunately, I don't know why it stopped, but certainly would love to see that again.
What we did for the teacher was we took the letter and we blew it up on like 18 by 26 poster board so that they had that for their room, so.
Yeah.
Then any of the letters that would be written, we would get those to the teachers so that they would have that.
I mean, I'm certainly in favor of something like this. Just looking
And
at,
what we're hoping is if we can get it done and, you know, pull together in a relatively quick amount of time, if we could have it presented at the April board meeting so that we're not crowding out the May board meeting because of retirees and things like that.
Yes. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Anybody else for public comment?
Mr. President, could I
Yes.
ask a question?
Yeah.
I noticed that it said winners, Mr. Marr, will be selected. I don't have a problem with that. I just don't know is there a program award that the WTA is giving, or is it just a recognition for the first project, which is the
Yeah, we got in trouble last time because we're not allowed to give out money to non-members. But yes, we think we could come up with something that could be some kind of a token for those students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else for public comment? Seeing none, I'll close it. I would like to answer maybe one, two questions. The committee was not a hidden committee. It was not pulled out of left field. An email was sent home last Thursday to every parent in the district notifying that we were going to do a committee to discuss this. So that comment earlier was incorrect. And also previously at a previous board meeting, it might have been the last one, the fire alarm question came up again, and the answer was that it's still budgeted for this year because we just haven't done it yet. So it's not that it was pushed off, it just hasn't been completed yet. And as for the bid, we rejected the bid. So there's nothing else to do with that. It was rejected. We don't know what that contractor did, who they talked to, but it was rejected. So that bid is a dead subject to the board because we're not using it. Mr. Smythe, did you have anything?
I have something I'd like to add. Just for the record, I do not have any family members working in the district, but as a public school teacher, I'm a member of NJEA, so I do have to recuse myself at some times for executive minutes.
Thank you. All right, okay. All right. Seeing none?
Or just to further elaborate on projects that were included in the current school year budget, the 1920 budget, we are still in the 1920 budget. We are limited with when work can be done within the school buildings, when school is not in session, and it is not uncommon to include funds in a budget and to include them at the end of the school year or the beginning of the next school year over the course of the summer. Also, just because funds are included in a budget, and again, we budget 18 months out, so not everything that is included in a budget is actually performed. Sometimes it's done in anticipation of a need. However, if the need does not arise throughout that year, or if through the development of other plans, you know, the district moves in a different direction, it is not uncommon not to move forward with a project. With regard to things being budgeted, especially in the maintenance area of the budget, a good portion of the maintenance budget or the required maintenance budget was funded by the maintenance reserve, so it wasn't being funded as part of the tax levy, or we weren't asking for funds from the community for it and then not using them. The majority of the maintenance budget was funded through the maintenance reserve. So, and if funds are unused in a year, they are returned to the maintenance reserve as is required by statute.
Thank you. All right. Any board members have any questions at this point? No? Okay. All right, Mr. Smythe.
Right.
Go ahead.
Chair, also just in reference to the cars. There was myself and Andy and Russ and Christine. So there are 4 board members there, and no more.
Thank you.
Following up on our last week's meeting, as far as the budget discussion, I provided a handout to the Board of Education just for some talking points. Again, this is a budget workshop. If there's any questions with regard to any of the reports that have been provided for the budget, we have this opportunity to address them, not necessarily to go through on a page by page. But there are some topics that I wanted to have on the table tonight for the board to discuss and provide some direction to us as we move forward with this budget process. The first item being the budget calendar with the, we mentioned this last week, with the significant date of March 20th, which is the deadline for school districts to submit their tentative budget to the Department of Education. Again, that's more of a regulatory compliance review by the Department of Education and not necessarily what it is that the district is looking to include in the budget. And it can be revised up into including the public hearing that we have scheduled for April 28th. So we have tonight's meeting, we have a workshop meeting next week, and then we have our business meeting on the 17th with the hopes that we'll need to approve a tentative budget on the 17th, and that'll be on the agenda for the 17th. So we'll have this meeting, and then also majority of the workshop meeting for next week will be dedicated to the budget as well. Okay? Nothing on the calendar, as long as we're on the same page with that. State aid notices we received last week. As communicated to you with regard to, compared to last year, we had an increase of just over $238,000. That came in the area of categorical special education aid for the district. So that was welcome news. Okay.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Sorry, is that guaranteed now? There's no going back on that, or is that proposed and going to be flip-flopped 1,000 times between now and July 1st?
No, not that it could not be, withdrawn. However, based on our experience, that's the state aid notices we received, and I do not anticipate that changing. And there is additional state aid that is from the state that is to be applied to school districts, and you'll probably hear more about that in the news. However, I would not anticipate any of those funds being made available to Wall Township because we're not receiving the adjustment aid that they're looking to, provide to those districts that took significant hits over last year and again this year. We're not in that category.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, do you have any idea how underfunded our district is compared to other similar districts? Have we ever looked at that?
We could have a whole separate meeting on that. However, because it also depends on what you would consider and how you apply whether we're adequately funded or not. With regard to the funding formula, I mean, the idea of the funding formula is that districts are being funded in accordance with the formula, and that's the issue with a lot of the districts that are experiencing significant cuts because they're not receiving the adjustment aid that they were receiving to mitigate the cuts that they would receive if the funding formula was applied in accordance with the formula. We're pretty accurate with regard to the aid we receive is in conformity with the funding formula. So it's not that drastic one way or the other for our district. That's why we're actually receiving an increase to the state aid because the funding formula is being applied.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with regard to the revenue and appropriations, the summary that was provided and we discussed, that was updated to reflect the increased state aid. And then in addition, on the appropriation side, the only thing that changed was the additional staff that was included. Originally, when we discussed it last week, there was a couple positions that were put in as part-time position, although the recommendation coming from the school was for a full-time position. We revisited that, and the positions included in this summary are as recommended at the building level, so they're for the full-time. The two specifically are the family liaison counselor for the high school as well as central school. And I don't want to go into too much detail because I'll leave that to Dr. Gleason. I just wanted to bring up that, those positions as well as a couple additional identified are included in the appropriations. So if you go to page 2 of 2, where we have provided the contract salary accounts, and I also provided the non-contract salary accounts, athletic co-curricular, and the proposed staff for 2021 budget, the proposed is $452,000. Last week, it was approximately 285 or 258. So there were additional positions that were included in here. But those proposed positions are included in the total of the appropriations. And if you look to the bottom of that sheet, we have the number 39,347, or the negative 39,347, and that's currently where our appropriations exceed our revenues at this point in time. And that only means that we just haven't finalized the budget. There's other line items that may be or will be tweaked as we move through this process, and it's more of a, not so much to get hung up on the dollar amount and how are we going to find $39,000. It's more the application of, are we looking to include the additional staff? Are we okay with the revenues we've projected? And what's the board's position when we consider the tax levy and the available funding that is available to the school district?
Brian?
Yes.
The RAP program, are we going to see an increase from that, or is it going to hold the same in this coming budget?
We would anticipate that the revenue you're referring to, right?
Yes.
For the facility
Yes.
use, it would be the same because they're utilizing the same space within the facilities.
Okay.
Brian, can I ask a question going forward? I hate to do this, but suggestion for future delineations of this sheet?
Sure.
Can we get numbers next to each of the rows? So when you say it's the 2,774 line number, it just says, line 7, and we can find it a lot faster? I'm finding myself a little
Duly noted.
dazed by the numbers. Thank you.
Okay. And again, this is, the sheet was provided last week, just the state aid number and the proposed staff number has changed, but I didn't know if there was any questions with regard to it from the way it was provided last week or the sheet we have tonight. Sure.
Yeah, on the first page, the general revenues, you looks like you got some capital reserve drawdown and some maintenance reserve drawdown that looks as applies to the general revenues. Do you, and I guess maybe it's in the book, I didn't look close enough, do you know what the current balances are in those accounts? And if we're drawing down, look at, I'm looking at the past years, it's wildly different from year to year. And I know that was because of certain, whether it's the HVAC and those things like that we pulled money out to pay for.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering how you came up with the 250 in each, and then what would that leave us in the account?
With regard to the capital reserve and going by the order, I think we're a little over $2 million in the capital reserve, but I'll follow up with the exact number. And the maintenance reserve should be $500,000 in the maintenance reserve.
And Brian, the $2 million is in the capital reserve after the HVAC project is complete?
Not counting, well, not complete, but that's aside from what we've budgeted in the current school year for the HVAC problem. The one we just approved Yeah, this would be separate from that or in addition to,
So as of July 1st, it's estimated that we'll have 2 million in the capital reserve.
yes,
That's what I'm just clarifying.
yes.
Okay.
And the 500,000 in maintenance reserve, that's what'll be left after the 250 is taken, drawn out?
No, that would be now.
Oh, now, okay, now, okay.
However, I would anticipate that when we finish this year, and from what I said before with regard to the maintenance reserve, we funded our maintenance account significantly by the maintenance reserve drawdown last year. If those funds are unused, they have to be returned to the maintenance reserve. They don't go towards your 2% surplus. The same with the capital reserve. And we funded 100% of our capital construction budget from capital reserve. So any unused funds from that, those two accounts will be returned to the capital reserve.
Right, and your expectation is that we have roughly 500,000 in the maintenance reserve. You could see that ticking up a little bit if there's unused by June.
Yes,
money
and
left
we've
over.
always, under the, I wouldn't, we're looking to maintain $300,000 to $500,000 in our maintenance reserve
Right.
in the future. And this budget would also anticipate or look to maintain that level of funding in there.
Right, so I guess my point is just from, looking at it, it's like you got, just say 500,000 in, you're looking about taking 250 out for the next year's budget, but you're anticipating some money going back in that we didn't use from the prior year's budget. So
Correct.
it's like some money's going in, and it goes from 500 to just say it's 50,000. So it goes from 500 to 550, but then you're taking, because that's 50 didn't use from last year's budget, money that was unspent.
Correct.
So that goes back into the account. Then this year, we're gonna take out another 250. We may only use 230 of it, which would mean 20,000 goes back in next year, or we may, so again, it's like it's an account that goes in and out, but the money doesn't go back into the normal, it has to go back into that fund as opposed to being used.
It can only be used for
Yes,
maintenance.
exactly
It-
right.
Required maintenance, and the same with the capital reserve.
Right,
And
okay.
in addition to that, aside from the funds that we budgeted being returned to the maintenance reserve, if there's other, at the year end, balances in the account or funds in excess of our allowable 2%, we've, routinely designated funds or transfers into our maintenance reserve, our capital reserve, and our emergency reserve, so that we can try to keep, a steady revenue supply to offset, any particular budget year where we may have a significant increase. Such as last year with our health benefits, we had a large increase, but we had funds in our emergency reserve that we relied on in order to help fund that. And we have been moving toward, and I think Mr. Nasser commented on this a couple meetings ago, that we rely heavily on our reserve accounts for funding our annual school budget, especially our capital reserve. Like I said, 1920, there is no funds included in our annual recurring revenues for facility projects in the current 1920 budget, and I don't anticipate there being any in the 2021 budget either. It's going to be funded, like we have $250,000 as a capital reserve drawdown included as a revenue. Our capital reserve appropriations that qualify for that capital reserve drawdown is about $257,000. So 250 of our 257,000 capital projects facility budget is funded from the capital reserve account, and that's $250,000 that is estimated for student transportation upgrades with regard to the shared service agreement with Howell, and $17,000 that are budgeted for professional fees and contingencies for projects, perhaps including excuse me, that project. So again, we're going on our second year. However, we're cognizant of the fact that we are looking at another funding source in a referendum. So it may be a good philosophy or approach to continue to fund those with the capital reserve as long as we have those funds in there until such time as the board does make a final decision on a referendum.
Right, with the capital reserve, generally every year, what's our average that we roll into it? Do you know that?
Now, it can vary, and again, it varies on, especially the capital projects. Like we budgeted $2.4 million for, for transportation. We used a portion of it for the fund, so that was significant. Our biggest, contributor is an unsettled contract with, our largest collective bargaining agreement. And, when you're budgeting projections, and then you settle the contract, if there's breakage in that, that's gonna roll over as surplus at the end of the year. If, we're self-insured with health benefits, as the trend is running right now, we're gonna have a significant, and hopefully it continues, we should have significant balance in our health benefit line item at year end. As long as the trend of the first 7 months continues for the rest of the year. We're not gonna be able to put all those funds into the emergency reserve for, to offset health benefit increases in future budgets, because we're limited on the amount of funds we can keep in there. However, we will have the ability to put those funds into either the maintenance reserve or the capital reserve, because we'll be in a situation where this way the board has control of those funds as opposed to not doing anything with them, letting them roll over as undesignated surplus, and then we're required to use them as a revenue in the subsequent budget as opposed to using a portion of them or applying them as the board would like. You're mandated to use the entire amount that's over the 2% as a revenue. And as much as, someone says that is there for the purposes of tax relief, it's not mandated to be tax relief, because you can still go to your 2%, and you can still use bank cap, and you still can use that as a revenue source. So that's somewhat misleading that excess surplus goes towards tax relief in the subsequent budget. That's not necessarily the case. That would have to be a conscious effort by the board to not have a tax increase in that particular year.
Was that surplus that you're referencing the intention of the law, or was that just some individual or group of people's opinion?
Well, I think it's the intention of the law that, those funds in excess of your allowable 2% surplus, you're not permitted to maintain it in your surplus, so therefore it's designated as a revenue in the subsequent year.
But you could also argue it's tax relief by being used as revenue, so you don't have to increase taxes to fund capital projects or maintenance or other things that we don't have.
By putting it into the reserve, yes.
Right.
Because one of the problems with using it as strictly as a revenue source to offset an increase in the tax levy is it's not typically a recurring revenue.
Right.
So unless it's a one-time project, which is why you put in the capital reserve, because
Right.
that is a one-time project, if you try to use it for renewing costs, then the following year you're going to be in a situation where you don't have that recurring revenue.
Mr. Chair?
Right.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, so, again, one of the things that I think is very important, I don't know if I said this again, last meeting, but looking at our strategic plan, our goals for the district, which I'm going to assume the long-range facilities project took into consideration, or as an arm of that, is very, very important, because as you said, Mr. Smythe, the ability to make meaningful gain, in particular with our facilities, is very difficult. And so we have ideas on what else we can do. I think, though, it would be helpful at some point that we can tie some of those goals in the strategic plan, because there's no purpose in doing that, no purpose, to the goal, to the budget. So I'm looking at capital expenditures on page 2 of 2, REV and app detail, just so everybody knows where I'm looking at, and it's $499,240 for 2021. It's so detail with that will be forthcoming, or I know we talked about those other two accounts.
Yeah, those funds are made
The
up.
capital reserve and maintenance reserve drawdowns. But I'm interested in how that relates to our goals and our long-range facilities project, or whatever it's geared towards. It's capital.
Well, with regard to, that amount or those line items, because it's more than 499,000, the $250,000 is for the student transportation, another $17,000 is for professional fees and contingencies, which was part of the strategic plan or board goals to find, a site or housing for our student transportation system. So keeping that in the budget is following or funding one of the goals that was included in the strategic plan. The balance of that is for equipment, which cannot be funded from a drawdown on capital reserve. But there is technology equipment for and the details in the budget book with regard to, I think it's a backup server for our Google environment, which is in the 90,000 range. There's equipment for the custodial services and equipment for the maintenance department in a purchase of a vehicle, which was in the 1920. It's also in the 2021 budget. But those would be equipment. I wouldn't say that they tie to anything in specifics with regard to the strategic plan or the board goals. We'd have to move on to probably curriculum staffing with regard to the student success that it was part of the strategic plan, and then moving toward,
Isn't facilities one of the arms?
Yes, of the
So-
strategic plan, and it's under F&F.
Right.
So we're gonna fund that in the budget, and that's gonna be done in conjunction with our long-range facility plan. And we have to look at, which projects within that plan are best suited for an annual budget, whether it be this budget or subsequent budget, which projects would be most beneficial under a referendum funding scenario, or which projects may be beneficial in an ESIP, although that would be a last resort, not a big fan of ESIPs. However, they will be prioritized and categorized based on that. As part of this budget, we still need to meet as a Finance Facility Committee meeting to identify which of those projects we would look to include in here. With regard to, from a revenue and appropriation side, I would anticipate that, and if anybody wants to, discuss that in more detail tonight, we can do that. And it's not particular to projects, just that the funding would come from a drawdown on the capital reserve, so it's really a wash within the budget. So whatever we want to include in the budget, we would fund it from a capital reserve, so.
Mr. Smythe?
Sure.
Capital expenditures over the last 4 or 5 years that are listed on the bottom of page 1. Little history lesson for those of us who are new, perhaps. It goes from $1 million, 15, 16, down the bottom, looks like $1.5 million roughly. 784, 854, you see where I'm at?
What page on? Two.
No, page 1 of 1.
Okay, one.
2021 Report of Revenues Appropriations, I think it's the updated version we got today. It's the same, I didn't know if they changed or not.
Yeah, no.
So you see where I'm at, the capital expenditures?
Yep, yes.
Big jump with the HVAC, obviously, in the last 2 years. We're at our lowest point here projected, for this year. The 784, 854, can you give any info on, was that adequate? What was done during that time? Like, just trying to get an idea. If 500 seems like a small number on a $75 million budget on a school district of our size and scope, from my perspective.
I would agree 100%, and and that was touched on last week, that the only project that is included in this budget is the student transportation improvements for the shared service agreement with Howell. And again, that's funded by a drawdown on the capital reserve. The other projects have yet to be identified that we're going to look to include, and we'll meet as
Right, and then, again, not specific to projects, but just in terms of general number, I would just put out there that I think we have to be considerate of that going up significantly for us to meet expectations. But that's, again,
in a long-term goal, $750,000 to $1 million a year
is that more
would be
of
reasonable.
a bell curve middle, so to speak, that we're trying to shoot for, based on the size of our budget, or is that low too?
That could be subjective and
Sure.
depend on what you want out of your facilities and how much money you want to put into them. But I think, historically in this district, that if we maintain $750 to $1 million a year, we can make significant gains
Okay.
in improving our facilities and maintaining them.
And in terms of the surplus potentially available through other sources that could turn into revenue. That's not included in this, is that correct, or that is included?
The anticipated balances at the end of the current school year is included as a revenue.
It is in what we're seeing here.
Yes, it says the budgeted fund balance line item. I'm going to guess that it would be about,
The
Number
million
seven.
seventy, yep, the million 76 there,
yes.
okay. So
And that
that's,
number
there's
of-
no new money to throw in 2 months or anything, or 3 months when we get closer to the end of the fiscal year is what I'm getting at.
Well, what would happen at the end of the year if we, because again, being self-insured, depending on what happens in April, May, and
Right.
June claims, in June, school districts have the ability to transfer unanticipated surplus into the reserve accounts, and that's what we'll do. We'll look to pass a resolution at June. It won't be used in the 2021 budget, but it'll be used,
All right.
it could be used during the school year, or it could be used to refund those capital reserve accounts and maintenance reserve accounts that we're gonna be drawing down on.
It can't be in the budget, but it can be used during the school year?
Well, if you wanted to do a withdrawal from your capital reserve for a project, you do have the ability to submit to the
Gotcha.
Department of Education for that.
Gotcha, thank you.
Okay. That's on the revenue and appropriations, which would go to the next 2 pages, which is the tax rate impact based on our current tax levy. And this is provided, it's independent of, our appropriations. This is just simply provided as a discussion with regard to what we have the ability to generate as far as a revenue in this budget. And the statute is the 2% tax levy cap, which allows an increase of 2% on our current year general fund tax levy with available automatic waivers that would be included that we talked about and is available as bank cap. So what I provided is, just so the question comes up when we say, well, are we gonna, this is where we are when we're at 2%. Where can we be if we go to 1.5% or only 1%, or if we stay flat, we don't have any increase in the general fund tax levy? What does that mean to the average assessed home in Wall Township? And, this answers that question. So for the average assessed home, which is $481,500 in Wall Township, we're at 2% increase in the tax levy. On an annual increase, it's $75.64. And not that I need to read all these, but then I broke it down, at 1.5%, which is $62.50. At 1%, it's $49.36, which, when you start, and the reason why I wanted to have the discussion with regard to this, when we're looking at a 2% tax levy increase, the increase, or as a revenue source, is $1.3 million to the district. Yet, if you wanted to, separate that, and only go to 1%, so you're going to be $700,000 increase in the general fund tax levy, the savings does not appear to be appropriate. I guess that could be subjective, though, when you look at what the increase is in the tax rate, going from $75 to $49. So you're basically talking about, $26 a year to a cut of $700,000 in our annual, as a revenue in our budget. And going down to the second page, if we don't increase the general fund tax levy at all from 1920 to 2021, there's still going to be an increase in the tax rate of $23 a year. And the reason for that is because our budget is on a fiscal year of July 1 through June 30th, and that's why it's a 1920 budget that we're currently in, and next year we're going to work on a 2021 budget. And the tax rate, even though our general fund tax levy applies to our budget according to our fiscal year, the tax rate is based on the calendar year. So they take half of the 2020 tax rate is going to be based on the half of the 1920 general fund tax levy that we didn't raise yet, and the first half of the 2021. So you would really need to have 3 years of no general fund tax levy increase to have a flat tax rate in the calendar year. But I think you know, from a simple approach, it's, even if we didn't increase the tax levy at all from budget year to budget year, there would still be a tax rate increase on the average home of $23. And at 2%, it's an additional $52 at $75. And I also included, what the total would be in the event that we were at 2% plus the bank cap.
And Brian, the bank cap is up to that million, or it can be any subjective number below that, or is that the only number we can use as the whole million and change?
It's up to that, it's up to that number. So the bank, that is unused spending authority that we generated over the last
Right.
3 years that are available. And a portion of that will not be available beyond 2021.
What portion of that is?
I said it last month, or last week, I meant to check it. I think it's about $600,000 that we generated 3 years ago.
So we'd be foolish not to use that, correct? Or am I missing the boat on that?
Well, please.
Yeah, no, it's
Or is it deceiving?
it's deceiving because it's really not money that we have. It's to get
You gotta
into-
raise, it's just the allowance to use it.
Right.
You
So
gotta
we'd
raise the
have to-
taxes for it,
But
but
you'd have to go, like he said, to get that match money, you'd have
gotta
to
go
go
up
raise
six-
taxes
right.
3%, up
Gotcha.
3% to use that.
that's right. So it's not real banked money. It's
No,
just
it's
an
not
opportunity
money
to
in any
raise
account.
more
It's-
based on the law.
Right. It's a fact that we only raised taxes 0.98 last year. We could have raised it 2, or the previous board could have. They didn't. The money that they didn't raise last year, the law says, well, now you can tack it on to this year's if you wanted to. But
If you need it.
Brian? So in terms of these numbers for the households, I think obviously having that median rate of 481,500 is good. I mean, I don't know if having that $500,000 column in there is necessary. So I mean, could we look at maybe the breakdowns of like 250, 481, I don't know, 600, 750, something that gives us a more accurate gauge on the higher end? Because I mean, I don't know if there's very many houses in Wall Township that are assessed at $100,000. I mean, right? I mean, is it, no. So I mean, that first column, like almost.
Well, if the average is 481 and there's a lot of $1 million homes, there's gonna be something on the other end of the spectrum. But the reason why the $100,000 is there is so that you can multiply it easily. So if it's 700,000, just multiply it by 7, 800,000. So the 200,000 is just kind of, doesn't have that much application perhaps, but that's why we include the 100,000 for.
I'd like to see something at like maybe like 6 or 7, because I think it scales up a little bit more, right?
No, it'll be
Perfectly
straight.
flat, straight through?
Multiply by 7.
Oh, each 100,000? Okay.
So you can double the 500 for $1 million assessed value, or multiply the 100,000 by whatever the number is, 7.5 if it's 750,000. So, but it's, to put in perspective when we're looking at, we're at 2% right now. It's somewhat of a balanced budget. The questions that we would want to discuss is, it's philosophical. It's, the 2% is a restriction. It's supposed to keep taxes in check by public entities, specifically, for us, as a school district. But it is spending authority that, if was available, the district would use those funds. Last year it was the decision of the Board of Education, and it was discussed that, hey, we anticipate a referendum. We can't be going to the well and then also then going to the well each year and then having a referendum. So we were at 0.98. If we were to go in that direction this year, I would think at this stage it would be difficult. We wouldn't be looking at the proposed staff, and again, we'll talk in more detail about that. But other than that, again, capital reserve, and if anyone disagrees with how much we should be budgeting on an annual basis or doesn't quite understand that, we're not funding anything in our annual budget, our annual revenue, as a recurring expense for capital improvements. But we're funding it from a capital drawdown, and as long as, and part of the other justification for it is, we've been replenishing it at the end of the year. So, and again, that goes, there's a lot of reasons for that, unsettled contracts, et cetera, being self-insured for health benefits. But if we have the ability to continue to replenish the funds in the capital reserve account, then it's okay to fund the capital facility projects as a drawdown from capital reserve.
So, Brian, the bottom of page 1, you said the 2% were close to a balanced budget. I just want to clarify, it's 111,000 off, correct? So is that something we need to find in cuts?
That was last, currently it's 39,000.
Oh, that was the last version, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's, because we got the additional
The
state
state aid.
aid, we did include
Got it.
additional staff, so
Looking
we're
at the wrong
about
one.
$39,000, and then, you know, that could be an adjustment to the budgeted fund balance number, because that's a rough estimate, and that number is only specific here to get to more of a rounded total revenue number.
So, at a previous F&F committee, I had asked to see, going forward, some type of report on last year to date budget for the year to date, so we can see kind of where we're tracking. Is there a way to get that to May 1st, to April 1st or something, so we can get a sense to one of the questions that was posed,
Yes.
how much we're spending,
this
where
is what
we're
we
over, where
budgeted?
we're under?
We'll
Yeah.
show this is what we budgeted.
I mean, broad strokes, obviously not by program or by school, but academics, maintenance, so on and so forth, whatever you think is the right breakout,
Well, we'll
just to
break
get
it-
an idea.
It'll be broken down by each account, because we have our original appropriation, what our current appropriation is, what we spent to date.
Would it be on one page like this?
Yeah, it'll be
Yeah,
on a lot
I don't
of
want
them.
to, I don't, that's the thing, I'm trying to figure, how do
Well,
we
just
get it on
multiple
a
pages, because
summary?
there's a lot of accounts. I could try to
The
summarize
general
it.
is really the main one, right?
Sorry?
The general fund is the main one that's carrying all the balance?
Yeah,
Now, the report you're asking for that we get, and we've gotten in the past, it lists all the different accounts, but it actually shows you where sometimes money's taken out of to go into another
To
account.
transfer, understood.
Yeah, so I wouldn't suggest trying to cut that down. I think that gives you the true picture of what's budgeted for an account and what is needed.
but I think what I could do is aggregate them so that it's,
Well,
know,
whatever you do,
required
let's take a stab
maintenance,
at it so we
custodial.
can start to
Conversation.
compare it, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Brian, I got a question. What does the district spend right now on their debt service on a yearly basis to carry the money that we owe for anything that we have?
the budget amount, both principal and interest, is 3.1 million, and we get about $780,000 in state aid toward that.
So out of this budget, every year,
Separate. The debt service is separate. It's included in the tax levy, but as far as the total number of 75,211,000, debt service is not in that number. This is just the current expense, or the general fund plus our capital budget. Debt service is viewed differently because that is debt that was already approved by the voters in a referendum, or it would only be typically a referendum. So that's already been approved. If we had an April election, we wouldn't be going to the voters for approval.
right, but you physically have to write a check to somebody, to the bank, for the money that we borrowed 20 years ago,
Yes,
right? And that money has to come from somewhere. And that's going to come from the tax levy that we ask the people now to pay taxes today
correct.
to pay for the money that we borrowed 20 years ago, right? So that, when I look at this sheet that you gave us, what I'm getting at is, last week we talked about how there was basically, after teacher salaries and administrator salaries and paying the lights and the gas bill and all those types of things, there was basically $10 million that we had left to play around with as a discretionary money that the board could look to play with. I guess what I'm asking is, I don't understand your answer that it's not part of this. Like, where does the money come from, or how do you pay it if it's not showed as an expense? Am I saying that right? I don't know, Russell, if you can maybe jump in.
I guess if I'm paraphrasing, is is the carve-out for the debt not included in this tax levy number? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So we get 85 million, but 3 comes right off the top and it's not including it, something like that? I mean, I'm making up numbers. Don't quote me on
Understood.
what the tax levy is or isn't, but in the 75 million that you're saying, or the 67,292, it might be a $70 million tax levy that you've carved out 2.3 million already for the debt payment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, what happens is the 67, this is only one fund for the district. This is Fund 10. So this is our general current expenses for the year. Debt service is considered a different fund. So the only thing the Board of Education is looking to prepare and approve is this annual school budget. So we have our general fund tax levy of this amount of $67 million. In addition to that, we have a debt service tax levy of $3 million, or 2.8, or whatever the number works out to be. Those two numbers are combined to calculate what the tax levy is for the calendar year that the tax rate is based on. It's not part of this because it's already established.
I get that. That just seems so misleading to me.
So much what?
Misleading to me. I mean, you know.
But it's also standard in that it's not going to change, right? So maybe it doesn't
Right,
affect
but
the
if
increase.
I look at this and I think if I'm a member of the public and I'm looking at the tax levy and I see that we're bringing in 67 million and this is only one fund, that leads me to ask the question, well, what, do you have other funds like that we don't know about? Like, what's going on? Like, and I know it's perfectly all legit. It seems to me that, you know, in my world, it would be total amount of revenue added in, whether it's coming from this tax levy or some other tax levy that gets added together behind the scenes that the taxpayers pay. Okay, and then, and I know it's stagnant, right? Because it's the same money every year, right? It's on a schedule, amortization schedule, I'm sure. And then so then you're saying, well, down here is the expense of it. It's just, I would just think generally accounting would be you account for the revenue and you account for the expense. But I get it that you know, again, you're the expert. I'm just saying, when I think of that, I'm saying to myself, I know we're paying a lot. I guess the point is, if we did nothing in 2 years from now, or whenever it is, I believe, right, that debt service will stop, right? We have a large amount of money coming off.
Correct.
That we stop paying for, right? So in 2 years, we'd say, okay, we don't know anything anymore. I don't know what the exact number is, but I know it's a substantial amount. So instead of paying $3 million a year that the state pays us $600,000 to help us out with that. So we're on the hook for 2.4. Well, maybe that drops to $500,000. So we're saving $2 million a year. A couple of options with that, right, is if we go for a referendum in the next year or two, whatever we would raise in revenue, say we went out and borrowed $40 million, the amount of money that we would have to debt service would be the amount of money that we're paying then would be the same as we're paying now, so it would be no real increase on the tax levy. It's kind of like when you buy a car and you pay it off, you're paying $300 a month for a car payment, and then all of a sudden the month comes when you pay the car off. Well, next month you have no car payment, but if you go buy a new car, you just continue paying this $300 a month. So it seems like you're just continuing to pay the $300. So your options are either don't buy the new car, which would don't do a referendum and just save the $2 million and use the $2 million to pay for anything that we need, which isn't feasible.
But I don't think that debt service tax levy comes to us then, because we won't have a debt to pay. So we don't
Correct.
get that 2.3, so that's really not money that would be available to us then. We don't have to pay it, but we don't raise it either, is that correct?
So what would happen is the tax rate would drop.
Right.
We won't, that
It's-
$2.6 million or whatever the dollar amount that we're going to talk about, that's going to come off the tax levy. And it's going to come off the tax rate. We can't otherwise spend that money.
No, agreed.
Okay.
But to the average person at home, they would be like, oh, the school board doesn't need that 2.6 anymore to pay that debt, so therefore they don't need to raise 67, they only need to raise 65. Because if they raise 65, they can do everything that they were doing before with 65 that they needed 67 before.
which is not the case.
Well, all right, so it would be 70 and 67 then.
Yeah, because
Right, okay.
that number is not part of this.
I got, all right, so it's 67, I'm reading it off the sheet. So really, it says 67, we're really raising 70
But not as part of this budget. This budget is 67. The debt service was already approved. The voters approved that in 1998.
correct, I understand that. But the revenue to pay for that debt service has to come in this budget.
Not in this budget, in the tax rate as part of the tax levy on the calendar year. But it's totally separate than this budget. This budget is just for our annual expenses.
I think the best way to describe it, Joe, is let's say the school district goes out of business, right? There would still be that debt service that's automatically billed to the taxpayer until it's paid off.
I got it. I think we're semantics here. I got a piece of paper telling me that the tax levy is 67 million.
Right.
And what I'm hearing is the tax levy is really 70 million. I don't know how else to say it.
So I think the tax levy line should say general operating tax levy, and then there's a separate tax levy for debt service. So it is one tax levy that's
Right.
legally got a cement wall between it.
Well, and that's fine, but that's
Right.
why I'm saying it's semantics. But at
Agreed.
the end of the day,
No, you're right. there's-
we're getting both from the taxpayers this year.
Right. One
right?
we can control and one we can't.
Right.
Right.
I guess that's the
And
point.
this one only represents the one we can control or have some impact.
Right,
not
so when we
control per
raise
This is
se.
the general fund budget, and this is the general fund tax levy. That's the debt service budget, debt service tax levy.
Right, I understand. That goes on in perpetuity. It just keeps going each year. It's gonna raise $3 million or whatever it was that you said. And that's gonna be whatever the tax rate of that has to be to raise that amount of money based on what the value of the houses are. They're gonna have to figure out what the rate is, and that will change each year,
Well-
depending on how it would.
Just
on how much
complicated
they have to-
further, the rate that's provided here, based on the average assessed home, includes the debt service tax levy.
We're really not increasing their taxes as much as it looks like when you say $75 a year for a certain price point.
Well, the
Or
idea of the
assessment.
debt service is that's pretty stable.
Right.
So there's not a whole lot of fluctuation in that.
Right.
But say in 2 years, all our debt comes off our books. That tax rate increase or the tax levy on that average assessed home is gonna drop.
Right. So let me ask you this, Brian. So for 2%, at $500,000, $78.55 annual increase. You're saying some of that $78.55 is already accounted for in the debt service.
Well, no,
Is that what you're saying?
I would say, I wanna say yes, but I wouldn't view it as the increase. If you look at the tax of $5,555 includes the tax for the debt service.
Does the 570.69 as well for the half? Well, all right. So does the proposed increase?
See, if
It
you look
does,
at
then.
2019, 2020.
Right. So the
2019
550.
is 5,479.
Right.
That is
That-
half of the general fund tax levy.
Right.
And half of the debt service tax
Got
levy.
it.
As applied from the 1920 budget.
Right.
And then, and 1920
And half
budget,
of the
and
next
also the
year.
1819 budget. The 20 tax rate is the general fund tax levy that we're discussing, as well as half of that, as well as half of the debt service tax levy. Both added together, they make up the 5,555. So yes, it's included in the increase, but there may be no change in the debt service tax levy. Like the tax rate generated by the debt service may not change. So the $75 increase is strictly the general fund. Most likely, only because there's slight variations in the debt service because of the way it's paid out.
You had me and then you lost me.
Sorry.
Because if the two totals include the debt service, how does the increase that's the difference between the two numbers, not include the debt service.
No, it does include, well, it does include it, but it's not as though there's an increase in the debt service.
I understand that. So that increase that we're seeing, 7564, just because I am not very good at anything in math. If you took out what the debt service was, $6.12, I'm making up a number. The actual increase for the budget we're discussing is really only $69.15, whatever the math adds up to be. I'm making up numbers. Fair to a degree?
If our
I'm not
debt
asking you to quote it.
If our debt service was paid off, yes. But that $6 that makes up the debt service, if we didn't have the debt service last year or this year, it would come off both. So it would still be a $75 increase from year to year in the tax levy. That's because the increase of $75 is a change in the tax levy. So if there's a change in our general fund tax levy, which there is, we're increasing it 2%. If there's a change in the debt service tax levy, then yes, the increase of $75 is made up of both of those increases. But the debt service tax levy doesn't change significantly from year to year. There's slight variations. So, of this, it's not so much that of the $75 increase, a portion of it is made up of the tax levy. A portion of the $5,555 is made up of the debt service tax levy, but so is the year prior. So whatever that difference is, then you would attribute that toward the increase. But practically speaking, the increase in the tax rate is because of our general fund tax levy going up 2%. And what I can do is
I think it's important, and maybe people are eyes glazed over here, but I think it's important because I'm going to tell you my intention after leaving here is to throw out these ideas to people and say, this is what we're thinking about. This is what it could cost you. I want to tell them what it's going to cost them for what we're going to vote on here in the next 2-3 weeks, not what's already been voted on 2 decades ago. So I'm just trying to get what is the actual number that this budget is going to cost me and my neighbors and anybody else I know that lives in town in a ballpark roundabout number based on their housing assessment. And so I thought I had it, now I'm more confused.
Well,
so maybe we'll talk about it offline and I don't want to belabor the whole point.
And that's a good point, is what is this budget going to cost the taxpayer? And the debt service tax levy is a wash. It was there last year, it's going to be here in this budget, and it'll be in the next budget. That's not going to affect what the taxpayer is going to contribute toward this budget. The only thing that's going to affect that is this general fund budget. Whether we go to 2%, 1.5%, 1%, that's going to make the difference. The debt service we have no control of the debt service, and it's not changing anything with regard to the amount they're paying. Your control is in the general fund tax levy.
Mr. Chair? Yes. So I understand that, well, I think I understand, but I appreciate the questions because it illuminates a lot for us and gives us a chance to understand it better. So if the debt service is already built in, is what I'm understanding, and it stays relatively flat, as you said. So the 7564 at a 2% budget is paying for the operational budget, because in that operational budget is already the debt service payments. And
Now, the 7564, you're talking about the total revenues?
no, I'm looking the increase, the $75.64. If we were to go at 2%, it's just I don't want to minimize it, but an annual increase for operating the school district.
And the annual operating expenses.
Right, and as part of that operating budget, although it would be difficult to pull it out, is the debt service. And I understand your point
But they
about
did
in a
pull it
couple
out.
of years it's going to go off.
But they did pull it out. That's what I'm getting at. This
Well, then
line
we'd
here,
have to
when
s-
when you look at this, and
Right.
it says $67 million,
Mm-hmm.
right? That is not counting the money that we're pulling in and then paying right back out for debt service.
Right.
Because what Brian, I think what he's saying is, this is the general fund that we're running a budget, that we're running on. If there was a subset line under this, there'd be another line that would say revenue from taxes that are not part of, like, when we raise it, if we raised it 2%, well, that part of the budget, that part wouldn't get raised 2%. That would continue to, the same amount of money would flow into that account. Whether we raise it 1%, 2%, 10%, whatever, that money, that would stay the same.
Yes.
But it would be a line under there that would say $3 million. And then down here, there'd be a line that would say, hey, we just, we paid $3 million in our payments. So it's kind of a wash, like he's saying. I get
Yes.
it. So, and I guess, there's rules on how these things have to be done. It's just, I'm saying, when I look at this, and people in the
Doesn't
audience
make
look at it and say, hey, we spent listen at home, $67 million tax levy. That is our tax levy. That's what we're getting to run the school district. And then all this other income that helps with that,
Right.
to get us to 75. But it's really not that. It's also additional money that we're collecting from the taxpayers that we're getting to pay the debt service. It's just not included on here because it's like we're blind to it. And that's
Well,
all I was saying.
With regard to this summary, because this is all this is the general fund, when you approve the budget and you pass the resolution, this number of the 2% increase, this is no longer, this isn't applicable because you end up approving the calendar year tax rate. And in that resolution, you identify what is for debt service. So you are identifying the tax levy for the purposes of debt service in that resolution.
At the point of the
And the general fund.
Well, at the point in the progress where we're at right now, we haven't seen that, right?
Correct.
We're new, so we got 6 new board members here that are doing this for the first time. So we get papers from you that say, here's a budget that's, basically half filled in based on numbers that really can't change that much. So we have some wiggle room, and that's why we're here talking about it in public, to figure out, well, can we cut here? Can we add here? Like, to Russell's point, maybe we gotta spend more on the capital expenditures. Like, these are things that we're gonna have to talk about and make decisions on, do we pull more out of reserve? Because maybe that's too, I just wanted to get a full picture of exactly what that is. And I guess, like I said, if it's in and it's out, it really probably doesn't make any difference for a tax levy point of view. Like you said, for the taxes on this 67 million, I get that. I was basically wanting to go down the road of when will we pay off what we're paying off, and when would we have to drop that number? But you're saying, well, that number is not going to ever drop because the money that we're getting from the tax is not in this fund. And I'm just saying that, to me, is semantics. That's just, well, the money's not in that fund, the money's coming into a different fund.
Correct.
Right, and that's, I guess that was my
But
point.
it's a different fund that you're not voting on or building. That's already done.
I understand that,
So,
right,
but that appropriation, that debt service, as well as this budget that we're working on, the tax levies for the two of those, the tax revenue is combined.
right,
And then that total number is used to determine what the calendar year tax rate is. Which is,
Exactly,
then you get to this sheet where it's broken down. So the 5,555
right,
is a combination of our debt service tax levy and our general fund tax levy.
right. That's what I was trying to get at, but I'm saying, when we get to that point, I guess down the road, that later on this month, that will all probably be on whatever documents that we're looking at. Right now, that's not on the documents because we're only looking at one side of this budget. We're not looking at the one that we have really no control over.
Yeah, which is, I
Right.
wouldn't say aside, it's just a different fund.
Right, a different fund, that's what I'm saying. And again, being new to this, I would, in my thinking, I was coming here seeing both, and I didn't see both, and that's why, hence all my questions about it. I understand what you're saying, and I get it, and I don't think, you're right, you probably couldn't include it in this format, because it would just mess everything else up. I just think it has to be kind of shown somewhere. Maybe that will be the next part when we get to that. You'll roll that out to show us that, I guess.
I could tell you, we don't
You normally
typically.
don't.
I think to Joe's point, maybe it was an indirect path to this subject based on your questions. It wasn't what your primary focus was, but I think from my point of view, I think it would be helpful for me to see what the resolution will say and what we will be approving, just to be prepared for the two sides.
Okay.
Because if the math that I just estimated, we're roughly gonna tax the townspeople $70 million, give or take, of which 4% of it is out of our control. So to me, that's an important story to tell when somebody says, where's the money going? Because when on your tax statement, you're gonna see X dollars, and I just wanna be able to transparently discuss what it is that the 8 or 9 of us are sitting here discussing. And 4% of it is not ours to discuss by law, and that's fine. I just think it's important for all of us in some capacity to practice our public relations skills of budget discussions, because we're gonna have a much bigger budget discussion to throw out at people in 9, 12, 15 months, whatever it might be. So that's just my opinion.
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Just getting started, Andy.
Well, and I'll just preface the next discussion with regard to, what are the next steps, or what the board's being charged with, and if you have any questions, you have any suggestions with regard to the board, obviously, but there isn't, at least from my perspective, an expectation that you're being charged with going through these budget reports, identifying cost-saving measures. If you have an opinion of something, absolutely, but it's more, the direction. Are we 2%? Are we below 2%? Like, what's the goal of the Board of Education?
How can you do that until the FNF committee prioritizes the priority? Then you'll know what the costs are gonna be.
Well,
Then you can do all this other stuff. I don't understand how you can do that before. I see this as a snapshot of a living budget that keeps moving. It's a snapshot to give the state and the county and get off the hook for that requirement. But that committee has got to prioritize what it is that we want to do, how much it costs, and then we could do some of the things that cost savings and all the other stuff. Otherwise, you got two things going on at the same time. It's just,
Ken, I
never
don't-
the two will meet.
I don't disagree with you, but if we look at expenditures for capital, which the FNF committee would pull out of the long-range planning, that's what you're referring to, right? Is that what you're referring to? The review of that plan to see what we
Yes.
can use in the
Yeah.
current year? I mean, I don't know how much, sure, we can do that, and I think we should. I just don't know how much
And
more. I
things that
mean,
are
it's
not in
250,
that plan
300,000.
that
Yeah,
people bring up.
agreed. I just don't know how
that
much
they
it's
want.
gonna change it that
Well-
much, because I thought, in my head, maybe because I was looking at the last couple of years, oh my God, we had $3.5 million of annual capital expenditures. We got quite a few projects we can do, but that's clearly not the case in next year's budget.
No.
So that, certainly limits the FNF's recommendations to another 250 to 500,000, which then will impact revenue and sure, change the budget, balance.
But there's also things we can look at the end of the year when we have money and we're gonna move it into a capital reserve. If there's a project, right, we can petition the state that we wanna do something.
well, you can do that, although they would not want you to be proposing projects that you should have included in the budget. So the fact that we do have funds in a capital reserve, and we can fund proposed projects that we want to include with the funds that are in the capital reserve, and then look to replenish at the end of the year. However, and that's a wash. So, in as much as that discussion needs to take place and the committee needs to meet, and we're gonna look to identify those prior to, we finalizing the budget on April 28th. However, I think the question would be, is from a philosophical approach with regard to the budget, the fact that we don't budget any recurring revenue for capital projects, do we want to? do we want to have, is the stipulation or the direction that of the 2% increase that we have available to us, plus these other revenues that we're adjusting, you know, do we want a portion of that to be dedicated to the capital improvement part of the budget? Or we think it's, you know, the 2% increase is restrictive, so therefore in order to fund the capital improvement part of the budget, we are willing to go above the 2% tax levy cap. You know, if the answer to that is no, we're not, well then we're restricted to the drawdown on the capital reserve, which is fine, and we can approach it that way in what projects we're going to identify to include in the budget. However, if that is a discussion point where that would be considered by the board, well then, you know, that would mean should probably look at it sooner rather than later. But, you know, that's, again, what's the goal of the board with regard to, you know, funding capital projects as an annual revenue, or are we okay continuing it, funding it through the capital reserve? Do we have a hard and fast line on the tax levy cap or the tax levy, or, you know, based on a potential referendum in the future, or, you know, because we were at 0.98 last year, or is that more dependent on what's included in the budget? You know?
Mr. Chair? Yes. None of us have the crystal ball, so, you know, as a person that just recently went through the buildings, and as a person that owns his own home, and et cetera, you know, we all know that there has to be improvements made in the district or to our homes. And so philosophically, recurring would be necessary even if we had the lottery win in 1 year and took care of everything, because as things go, our bodies break down, our buildings break down. I don't understand that question because I've already seen with my own eyes that approach of wait and see does not bode well for this district or for any district. And so without that crystal ball, one question, throwing a question back at you, isn't that something that we can, with each year, address? Whether it's a recurring, a philosophy of recurring,
yeah,
or...
well, I think what impacts that decision or discussion is, I think it's the referendum. Well,
and maybe that's the missing piece here. What are
leading
those?
up to a referendum, you know, the fact that, and we have funded our capital reserve account, and we utilize it in the current school year to fund the project, and that's been successful. And until such time as we make a decision on the referendum, we can continue down that path. And I have no problem with that. But, you know, that's just one approach. But what we're saying is we're not including in our annual revenues, not our facility maintenance, because we do have maintenance funds, the required maintenance or recurring maintenance. It would be the facility improvements fund. But we've had the ability to refund, I'll use the term refund, our capital reserve account. And based on that, I think we can continue to fund our capital based on the drawdowns. Especially until such time as we make a decision on the referendum. Hopefully it's a decision that we move forward with it, it's successful, and then once that is established, then we could get into more of a, you know, consistent or constant, you know, revenue balance with regard to our current expenses and our facility improvements, because we won't have the, you know, perhaps the large projects that we would look to accomplish in a referendum.
Well, and to me, that answers the question, because...
I didn't want to answer it, though.
No, no, but I appreciate that. I just, you know, without that crystal ball, without the referendum, you know, or some lottery like I said, we will run out of money in being able to do the things that now, right now, if we were to stay the way we are, need to be addressed. So I think, you know, another time to ask this question is when we reach that that decision of whether there's a referendum or not, et cetera, because we do have a responsibility to the students and to the teachers as well as the community. And that's interesting. That just gave me an aha, as well as the community, to keep these schools up.
Absolutely.
And if we don't, forget about your ratables and your taxes and all of that. It's just, it's very interesting.
But those projects that you're talking about, the here and now, that have to be done now, have to be put in a priority order. And we have to, then, that brings on more discussion.
Can we stay on this topic just to maybe put it to bed for tonight? For us to think about, you know, philosophically, we look at the budget capital expenditures, to stay on that topic, previous years, 784, 854, other than the 3.5 million. So we're anywhere from $1.5 million to 850,000. This year we're at 500,000. I would just ask the group to come back next week with what's the number you think we should be, regardless of what the projects are, Kenny, because I know we have to define them, but where do we want to be as a budget? Because I agree with Andy, and I agree, I haven't seen them yet, but I've been in enough of them in various ways to say, if we're not investing in them on a regular basis, it's going to cost us a tremendous amount more at some point in the future, which we're already seeing as a new board. And beyond, you know, some of the things Andy said, you know, the kids feed off a building that's, you know, running nicely and is bright and airy and is humming along. It's a pride factor for them. And, you know, in some indirect way, learning is enhanced in a building that's running better. So there is a direct correlation to the students by making the buildings better. And then to the community, the recreation programs and all the other ancillary uses, you know, they're going to continue and if not grow. So we have you know, we don't have an obligation to them as much as we do if we want to be good partners and good stewards of the community. So I would just ask us as a summary to come back in a week and say, you know, who's in for $1 million, who's in for so we can give Brian some ballpark, because then that's going to adjust where we go with F&F and where we go with revenue. Is that a fair request?
Yes.
I mean, open to hear your feedback, but we could talk about the what's for 16 more days here, and without knowing a philosophy, we're going to kind of bounce around, just my thought.
Mr. Chair, that's why I asked about the finance and the facility, the long-range project, because some of those things, the priorities, hopefully, were identified, but I don't know when the last time anybody looked at that. You know, this new board here, you know, we have a lot of catching up to do, and I think we're doing a good job in terms of asking the kinds of questions that we are. It's certainly been very helpful to me, illuminating, as I said. And so when I said thank you, I wasn't kidding. I appreciate it. But, you know, we do have that finance and facilities long-range plan, which was established before there was even a talk about the long-range committee. I mean, the referendum, so many words. So that, and then there's another thing that we throw out a lot of times. I mean, I'm not sure how much we've done our due diligence with the town and county and whoever else, other districts, in terms of shared services. And it's like a dirty word. People, you know, get very upset about that because it sometimes transcends more than what we actually mean by that. But where can we make the savings? You know, I've heard about the county with regards to paving, but there's a lot of things that we don't know in terms of the specifics that could say, well, that's really not, that's been explored completely and we can't do any more. And I'm not there.
Okay, you got like 12 minutes. So
I think mine's going to be hopefully less painful, so. Okay, the next two pages, 1 and 2, are the proposed staffing for 2020 through 2021. As Brian had mentioned, we brought much of this to you last week, but there are the addition of a couple of new positions, and I'll go through an explanation of those. They're primarily related to enrollment trends at the elementary grade level, so I'll walk you through those. But I'd like to take you through each of these. The first one is the addition of a half-time. There's a total of 8.5, I believe that's right, Brian, 8.5 FTEs in the proposed staffing. The first one is for a half-time or part-time 0.5 English teacher at the high school. And you can see the rationale. The rationales all come from the building principal. So that we've gone through each of these with them. They begin submitting their proposed staffing back in February and January and February, and we kind of walk through that with them. The one thing I would say with that first rationale is that Tomorrow's Teacher, which is that new course elective that will lead into the academy in the following year, we're tentatively running that under social studies, but it may move back to English. So that was one piece of that rationale, but the bigger part of that rationale, moving that teacher from 0.5 to full-time, is we're using, as I've talked to you about before, this RTI framework where we're tiering students in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 levels, which are like intensified levels of support for students who are struggling in either ELA or math. And we currently have 102 students who fall in those Tier 2 and Tier 3 levels, which those tiers are cut scores are determined by various assessments. And we do not have enough staff to provide those interventions. So that is the rationale for the 0.5 high school English teacher. Any questions on that one?
I do have a question about that one. 102 students. So that's the entire population, 9 through 12?
With Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions.
Right,
So we've already got the
right.
Tier 1s managed through classroom instruction,
Right.
and then Tier 2 and Tier 3 above.
Well, I only was curious about that because, you know, the goal is to move them down.
Back down to
Right,
Tier 1.
exactly. And I just wonder, in terms of the, you know, that support, how that might actually erase itself with the proper.
And over time, we might see
Yeah.
that. I mean, what we are definitely seeing, this is year 3, I would say really year 2 of a fully run RTI program. The
right.
first year was really just exploration. We're seeing incrementally increases in student achievement. We're seeing lower numbers in this year of those Tier 2 and Tier 3 students. So I think what we're doing is working. And ultimately, yes, you could see less and less of a need if we're really doing it with fidelity
Right.
from K all the way through 12.
Well, yeah,
But
and
that
the-
will take a few years to really see.
In the middle school, that's why I was asking 9 through 12, because if the numbers at the, you know, the lower grade levels, that's where the need is coming from. I don't know it's going to show a full picture yet, if you
Yeah,
understand.
it will take some time to get
Right.
there. The good news is that we're providing those interventions at all grade spans. So we have a math interventionist and ELA interventionist at the elementary level. We have interventionists that are part of the regular curricular program. They sort of run along the elective schedule at the intermediate school, and we've been trying to push that model into the high school, but we're short-staffed in doing that. We have, with Title I funds, provided an after-school program, and we're kind of the talk of the county right now because we're one of the few high schools that actually run an after-school program where students attend. So we've been really, really pleased with that, and kudos to the high school staff and the teachers and supervisors and administration for running that program. But we can't fully count on after school, and we're lucky to have those funds to do that with title funds. But I do think that increasing this one position to a full-time position, and that would be part of that schedule, would really benefit our students, and we have evidence of that. Any other questions on the first position? Okay, the second position, again, at the high school, is a full-time math interventionist. Same rationale. We do not have anyone providing math interventions during the regular curricular day. We have math interventions provided as the after-school program, and it's the only school that does not have a math interventionist. So we're looking again to really put some energy into math instruction and math achievement. Again, we're incrementally beginning to improve. We have done some really nice work with an outside consultant, Dr. Riccomini, this year, and we'll be working with him next year. So, and we have a lot of buy-in from the teachers, but I still think we need to follow that RTI model where we have a really structured way to look at student achievement and see who's still struggling and getting small group and individual time with them.
Lisa, the
Yes.
part-time English teacher above, is there an English interventionist already on staff?
So we currently have between a few teachers that have some time in their schedule providing some intervention, but we don't have anyone dedicated fully as a half-time FTE to provide interventions and then try to supplement it with this next.
And how many are in the math program that need this support?
You know, Russ, I don't have that number, but I can get you that number.
Just
It's
curious,
roughly
the half-time to full-time, 102 kids, why one's half, one's full? Where's the
Right, because we currently do have, as I said, a few teachers that have time in their schedule.
so they'll
that
stay in that
they'll
role
stay in their
on top of the
schedule.
half-time teacher?
Correct. So it really looks like a full-time person, but it might be split up between a few different
The
teachers.
4 plus a half kind
And
of
then this
approach.
this half-time person, that's correct.
And is it safe to assume that you have met with all of the building principals to evaluate alternatives to this hire?
We have, and we've been looking at this for quite a while, and that's why we started with the after-school program, where we had a pool of funds that we could immediately do something with without waiting until budget season. And we had a lot of success with that program. Again, it's an after-school supplemental program. We're required, as of 2 years ago with CUSAC, we're required to show how we have an RTI structure in place. We got ahead of that by about a year, but we are understaffed in providing a full RTI program at the high school.
And the 55 salaries, what entry point?
Correct, we're required to budget at that step one for all teachers.
So that's step one. That's
That
a
would be
first-year
correct.
teacher.
That'd be correct, Mr.
Correct.
Smythe? For step
So it
one.
could be higher, or pretty much you'll find somebody at that level?
No. Well, it depends, and it's partly by contract, depending on their experience. It's
Right.
whatever's the collective bargaining agreement, they have to be credited certain years. But as a district, we're required to budget vacancies at the first step of the guide. That's a review by the Department of Education.
So if you hire somebody on step 18,
So the state requires you to budget at the lowest possible number.
Yes.
And I'm here for what? That sounds utterly ridiculous.
It's one of the questions that they ask when we do our budget review. Are all vacant and new positions budgeted at the first step of the guide? The answer is yes.
Dr.
What is the
Gleason?
rationale?
It's so that people aren't artificially inflating their budgets with, top of the guide salary projections. Like, so we have 5 vacancies or new positions, someone's leaving at 90,000, that's what their salary is, and we're gonna maintain that. So, like a lot of rules and regulations, their intentions are well,
There's
they
one
just should
rule
not
to
be
cover all the-
applied
right.
to everybody uniformly,
Dr. Gleason?
Yes,
Are we going to continue with the after-school program?
we
in
are.
addition?
We are. In fact, we revised some of that programming to extend the length of time. We also added in social studies and Spanish. We were allowed to include additional subjects, and we've also increased the after-school counseling as part of Title I for some of our students who are struggling behaviorally or just in need of some additional counseling support.
And those funds don't come out of the budget, they're Title I funds?
That's correct. Those are Title I funds. Those are federal funds as part of Title I.
And I don't know if I misunderstood when somebody was speaking, but this is a full-time position that will be.
The math interventionist is,
No, well, the English also, it's going from half-time to full-time.
it's going from half-time
The
to
impact on the
full-time.
budget is half, I thought somebody kept referring to it as a half-time position.
That was probably me, but that was my,
But these are both full-time
both
positions.
full-time. It's going from a half-time to a full-time, the English teacher.
So the impact to the budget's half-time, but it's a full-time position, the English.
Okay, any other questions on the two first positions?
My last question, I'm sorry, and we anticipate those 2 positions to be necessary for an extended period of time?
We do, and I think, like Andy said, will we, in philosophy, the goal is that as we support kids more and more, and we really understand where their unique needs are, and instead of expecting them to fully succeed in a whole class setting, that you would ultimately mitigate that from both sides, because we're doing this all the way down in K-12. But I think that that will take several years to really, but we'll look at those numbers, and they're easy numbers to track because we've gone to this RTI framework where we tier kids at the end of the year. We use several measures, and we have cut scores, so where they'll fall. So I would say for the first time in the last 3 years, truly have metrics to measure how our instruction is doing and how some of these intervention programs are affecting kids.
And Brian, the 525 is with benefits or with just straight salary? So where does the benefit expense come in on the budget?
Comes in on the health benefit line item, oh, thank you, which we would estimate typically like $8,000. If we look at a policy for single is $10,000 with a contribution of around $2,000. However, we don't pay a fixed premium for our new hires. So it's not a straight dollar for dollar that we're going to incur that expense, and we include it in the estimate that we provide as we pay claims. And as much as we could say, well, it's $55,000, but it's really a $65,000 hit to the budget. The way we're viewing or projecting our costs next year for the claims, we wouldn't change that line item significantly for these positions. Because they could ultimately cost $600.
Right.
Because that's all the cost is.
I get that, and I don't know if I agree with it, but that's philosophy, and that's fine. I would prefer to see plus benefits or something that insinuates a clear added expense, because whether you shroud it in a side of moving money here or there or whatever we can do by law, it's still going to cost us something somewhere to have that insurance expense and or family or whatever level they might come in at. It could also cost us $72,000 if we can't find somebody that's coming in at level 1 potentially too. So we're not seeing true numbers here on these hires. And the other request I would have for all the hires, quite honestly, is this teacher, and I'm not for not hiring people, I just, this new teacher at 55, if we find them at that level, plus benefits 62, 63, that's with us for a decade, is costing the town over $500,000 in just 10 years, $1.2 million over 20 years if they stay with us. I would like to see a direct impact to the hiring of this person and what they've saved us, what they've impacted the kids, how many kids are not in the program, or what's the measuring impact of this hire. I think that's extremely valuable to see directly in a year that we hired Mary Johnson for this position, and this is the impact they had, as best as we can. I know it's not a perfect setting.
It's not a perfect setting, but it is relatively trackable. Because they're
Excellent.
working directly with students that are in these tiers, and we have, student achievement data. So we would pull a couple of measures, because you don't ever want to rely upon just one assessment, state assessment. But we can look at multiple measures, and we can do some tracking with the students that teacher would work with.
Because personally, I feel as though I would be much more open to future hires in certain programs if I knew, we hired so-and-so last year, and look at the data impact, look at the results, look at what we can say, why it was worth it, as opposed to sometimes a vague response as to why we need it. More kids in the program, the state's requiring CUSAC. I get all that. The state throws a lot at us that we have no choice to follow through with, but if there's a way to clearly show impact, I would be greatly appreciative of that.
I just want to jump in just for a moment. So tracking data, RTI is just a ton of data, and there's growth, and it's over a 6 to 8 week period, and you track the data and you track the growth and whatnot. But you also have to realize the reflectiveness of, student achievement. Yes, the teacher is giving it their all, but sometimes you have students who struggle and they're not going to make progress, and having that as a reflection, based upon the teacher. I'm not saying every student, but, there are occasional students who struggle, and they may make growth here and there, but I think that's kind of like a little bit of a touchy subject,
Well, I think that to say in 1 year, if you could align it to what the state had done with the SGPs. Okay, so when teacher evaluation went, where now the state was saying, we're tying your instructional value to a growth by students. That's difficult, as you said, Erin. Because when you're looking at kids who are struggling, sometimes it's purely an academic piece, and sometimes there are other mitigating factors. And so I do think it takes time, and ensuring that the instruction is really, strong instruction, consistent instruction, but there are mitigating factors. And so I think we can look at those numbers for sure, and I think looking at the numbers of students who are being impacted as well. But when the state finally started to get a little more realistic about that growth number that they used and they attached to teachers, first of all, they realized they went from 30% to 5% finally, and understanding that that's a big thing to attach to teachers. And then they also looked at growth over time. And so I do think we can look at it, Russell. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at it, but I do think that we have to be careful with saying it's not a valuable position, because you're talking about often your most vulnerable students who do need that extra support, and their growth it might not look as large on paper, but it's still growth.
So I can appreciate all that, and I thank you for clarifying that. Having been a teacher for 7 years and worked in schools for 20-plus years, I'm not looking for, we took, 12 students from A to Z in 12 months. I get that that's almost impossible to do, but I also know there's other ways to measure success. We've kept their discipline record to a minimum. We have kept them to a minimum GPA where they can participate in athletics. There's other ways to look at it from a positive standpoint. So that's all I'm suggesting. I understand trends, and I understand it takes time to make impact. So I would just ask that there's some effort to tie new hires to impactful results in some capacity, and to continue that discussion.
Absolutely. Any other questions on the interventionists at the high school? Okay, the next position, we talked about these last week. We had the proposal from both the high school and central school for school family liaison counselor. At first try, we moved this to 60% at the high school and 40% at central school. In going back to the building principals and discussing the position further, you can see the rationale on the side here. Both administrators feel very strongly about the positions as a full-time position. And at the high school, we continue to see significant mental health issues going on. We've had some, a lot of HIB that happens, and we have school family liaison counselors that have to, they're also the anti-bullying specialists, so they're tied up with a lot of that investigation. Sometimes that can take, it can blow an entire day up, just doing one investigation. So we're trying to get ahead of some of this rather than just reacting to what happens during the day. And a lot of our school family liaison counselors are not really able to attend to the things that they were supposed to be doing proactively, and that's the goal. Getting into classrooms, at the elementary grades, doing social skills groups, doing character ed lessons, and really taking a proactive approach. They're getting really tied into the HIB investigations, as I said, and other things that happen around mental health in the schools. And these two schools in particular, our largest elementary school and then our largest school with enrollment, it's not surprising that those are the two that are needing more support. And I think that you need only look out to the community at large, not just Wall, but our national community, to see that this is a growing need in schools to support kids, especially their mental health. So those are the two rationales at the high school. And again, as Brian talked about, we're budgeting the same, 55,525 for both positions. And that would be at the high school and central.
So, Dr. Gleason,
Go.
so typically a position like this, what kind of person would be in this position? Would it be someone who was a classroom teacher that moves up, or is this a specialty type degree where it's a social worker possibly coming in that would probably have multiple years experience? So realistically, they're not starting at $55,000 a year, touching on what Russell had mentioned before.
Potentially, and yes, they do. They may have been a teacher, but they are usually, I believe in these positions, they're holding school social worker. And they're in that role as both social worker, guidance counselor, but they're not part of the CST. As the school family liaison counselor, they're not part of the special education CST. They are working with general education students primarily. So in terms of could they come in and, based upon the contract, negotiate, for a higher salary, potentially, depending on their years of experience, or they could come in at step one.
I have, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I have a question. Are there counselors presently in the building with this title at both the high school and Central?
There's at every school, there is a school family liaison counselor, and I believe there are 2 at the high school right now.
Okay.
One of whom is also the anti-bullying specialist, so his position is
And-
tied up half with that.
Okay, so that's good. And the need is what you're talking about being greater than the caseload is greater than what they can handle.
Correct.
I'm just interested in knowing, we have guidance counselors, we have SAPs, that kind of thing, and what the support numbers are in the various buildings so that, we can kind of compare and contrast what's going on. Because obviously, as a board member, we see the HIB reports and we see other things in notices that speak to the issues. But I'm just curious about the allocation of staff in this particular area.
So at the elementary level, this role is, in essence, the counselor, the guidance counselor at that school. They don't hold necessarily the counseling certificate, but they're under the school social worker certificate, but not working as part of the CSD. And again, the role is that they're counseling, individual counseling, they're doing group counseling. They're also the anti-bullying specialist in the school, so they're working with any of those HIB investigations. One of the added responsibilities our counselors now have, or school family liaison counselors have now, is the 5th grade curriculum for suicide prevention and awareness. And so they go into the classroom with the health teacher and they co-teach those lessons. And that's brand new this spring. So that's been a big shift, moving that curriculum into 5th grade this year. So they have myriad responsibilities for sure. And I think they're doing a really good job with managing those. But again, when you look at Central School, you have the largest enrollment, so it's not unusual to see, larger need.
Lisa,
Yes.
just to clarify, you talked about a 60-40 split. Could you just say that again to make sure I understand?
We had originally talked about, we brought to the board last week, bringing 1 school family liaison counselor and seeing if we could have that counselor 60% of the time at the high school
Right.
and 40% at Central School. Just trying to sort of fiscally balance some of the positions we were looking at. But in going back to the principals, that was, not really acceptable for the needs that they have. And they're looking at referrals, they're
Sure.
looking at incidents and some high-profile cases that really need. So they've asked that we come back with a full-time recommendation at each school.
And Central has 1 already,
Correct,
and this will be a second.
correct.
And how many kids at Central?
Central has a little over 500. I believe we're at 530 on the enrollment at Central.
And the next biggest elementary school?
That is the biggest elementary school.
What is
After
the-
that would be Old Mill and Allenwood have approximately just under 400 or just at 400.
And they have 1 counselor full-time?
Correct.
And West Belmar has one?
West Belmar has one as well. There's
two-
about 190 students at West Belmar.
So these positions become more vital every year. I'm fully in support of the understanding of the challenges. Again, the numbers seem to be off in terms of the size and scope of schools, and full-time at West Belmar versus full-time at Allenwood is twice as much work. So if there's any way to go back and creatively share elementary counselors, because I personally think a high school HIB and a Central School HIB is going to be, vastly different, in terms of the scope and the involvement and so on and so forth, although I don't know for sure because I've never done one and investigated. But I can imagine it's quite a challenge. My other question would be, and this is more for me only because this is the way I think, I agree that if there's too many cases for one person to see and move forward, I would like to know in some data form, and I understand data doesn't tell the whole story, but it helps inform me. What are they not getting to? How many classroom visits didn't they get to? How many appointments with individual kids that are not suffering from immediate stress didn't they get to? I'd like to just see where are they going to be spending more time and where they're not able to spend time in some quantifiable capacity. Because this is all great, and I don't disagree with it, but it's in paragraph form, and I think by telling me we need to hire, again, somebody for $500,000 over the next 10 years, I'd like to see that we're going to be able to see 35 more kids a week or whatever the case, or an estimate. I understand that next year I'm not going to sit here and say, you said 35 kids and you only saw 12. It's a year, but I'd like to some try to guesstimate as to how we're going to
Sure.
improve from a quantifiable standpoint.
I think that's a fair question and certainly something that we can track. I also think it's a bit of a moving target because to your point about a HIB being perhaps more complicated or time-consuming at the high school, I've been a principal in a K-8, and I've had HIBs take up 3 days of my time. It really depends on the case. So the other piece is based upon where they're being taken on some of those investigations. In 1 week, they could be taken away from lots of counseling, everything, and another week be able to do all their character ed lessons and social skills and counseling groups. So I think it's, as I said, a bit of a moving target, but we could certainly take a look at that and see if we can get
Best case scenario,
some
what are we
data.
shooting for? That's,
Yep.
again, knowing it's all going to ebb and flow the way it ebbs and flows without our control.
Okay, good enough.
And just one other comment. So we went from, one position being split to 2 full-time positions. My understanding from what you were just saying is the split was going to be difficult. And I imagine that, I think what Russ was getting at is that the HIBs at the high school are going to be significantly different than the ones in the elementary school. So if you have a person floating back and forth from the high school to the elementary school, you got to change your hat, quite drastically on that ride over there. Was there thought given to having 2 part-time jobs on that? So so we're saying that we're approaching the sort of, full glass here where it's going to, go over, right? And to Russ's point of the, millions of dollars that you spend to have this person in the district for, 10 years or whatever it is it feasible to go back to the principals and say, hey, listen, well, what about a half-time, person there? Because again, and to Russ's point again, and we're looking at what, 28,615 for, half-time salary position. I would assume that a high school full-time position is probably not going to be somebody who's, shiny and new coming out of, college, and that person we might not even want to have, dealing with the high school problems, which are going to be significantly more challenging to some degree than the elementary school positions.
Well, I guess my question is, when we were first bringing this to the table last week, we suggested 60% at the high school. So are you suggesting going back and telling the high school that it would be only 50%?
Oh, no. What I'm saying is instead of having 2 full-time positions, saying, okay, we can have another a half-time position for the high school and another half position for Central. What's that? No, they would.
Right.
How about, just building off what Chris just said, though, and instead of 2 half-times, you do 1 full-time for the high school, and then can the person from West Belmar sheet over to Central School, since you're talking about 199 kids, where, Old Mill and Allen would have 300 or 400, and then Central has
Yep.
500.
So that was, of course, the first thing, when we started seeing this crop up, that was the first place we went, where we have, less students, and so a full-time person. And in fact, that school family liaison counselor is already working with going in and covering some of the need there, while the school family liaison counselor at Central is doing the suicide prevention and awareness lessons. So that's just that one piece impacted Central School already, and we're already using that family liaison counselor for that one piece. We could start to chip away more, but I also want to make sure that we're not trying to solve a bit of one problem and now creating a problem here.
Do we also have guidance counselors in the elementary schools?
Those are, I believe those, they act in the role of the guidance
okay, so
counselor,
they
I
get one time.
believe.
To repeat what we were asking before about the, some kind of quantifiable data, because I don't like the idea of there's 200 students at this school, there's 400. Without making people, spectacles of people, dysfunctional families, I see mental health. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. If that goes if that doesn't get taken care of, you will be in the front page of the newspapers.
I agree.
From other incidents that it will just build on. So it would help to have an idea. Maybe that school has the least amount of students and has the most need. That's what I'm after.
So we need to see numbers.
I think one of the things that are playing into this, as I kind of keep going back with the principals and trying to get a better understanding, one of the things that are playing into this as well, where you have a school where there's 400 and they're not seeing this as much of a need as the school with 500, right? Why? One of the reasons is that the school with 400 also has a full-time, I believe, school psychologist on staff. So there's an additional CST member that's a backup when we get to high-risk situations, students who need evaluation, they need to be screened for a mental health crisis. So they have already someone on staff there. Central School does not have a full-time CST member on staff. So there's another area that, that points to where they're lacking.
And they have that psychologist because of other programs that they have in the building?
I beg your pardon, Rizal?
That psychologist is in another school because they have other types of programs that demand her presence in that building?
And that school houses all of our self-contained
Right.
programs, exactly.
I'm just trying to think of the
Yeah.
model that we want to Ken's point, it's paramount, I think, to one of the things we do as a board, the mental health crisis that our society is dealing with that starts at whatever age you want to say it starts at, from before school even begins, sometimes you could say, for sure. So what is our model, and are we fulfilling, are we being successful in the model? Because it sounds like we have some disproportionate approaches, which I don't know if that puts us in a good position as a district, whether it be based on, that's why caseload, I think, is important. Like, how many cases did the 200-student school see versus the 400, and where do we need to, put out assets to deal with the problem in an effective way? I'm not against it. I just don't know if, in the position I'm in today, and granted, maybe I shouldn't yet at this point understand what is the workload and what is the expected workload or the successful recommended workload for these people, and maybe we need 5 more across the district. I don't know.
Well-
That could be something that comes out of the caseload, workload, quantifiable stats. I'm not sure.
So you bring up some great points. So first, across the board, I think we, as a district, have to make mental health a priority. And how we staff that represents the board's philosophy, for sure. I think that unlike special education, where you have a quantifiable caseload, right? A caseworker has 55 cases or 35 cases that they can say, this is what my workload is. In the school family liaison in counseling world, that can change daily. Student who we've never seen before comes in, there's some family trauma going on at home, there's, social trauma going on or drama going on, and, so that changes all the time, and again, you add on some of the other responsibilities, like their character education lessons, which are part of their job, that proactive piece, so that's part of the schedule, and then they're canceling those, they have to prioritize. So they have to deal with crisis first, counseling students who come to them regularly that are sort of part of their caseload, and then the character ed lessons, which are really important proactively in the classroom. Then you have to sort of put that further down on the priority list, which we don't want to do. So I think it's a position that's an important position, and I do think that
The HIB investigations would be a part of that.
yeah,
And just the last point, they're so disruptive.
they are very
I
disruptive.
can't imagine how a teacher gets through all this stuff. And some of the characters that I've seen come in, it's amazing. So,
Sure, well,
take-
a HIB investigation can involve, you know, each interview that you have with a child could lead to 4 more students who may have heard or witnessed or saw something, and so on and so on. And then the phone calls, and it's very, very time-consuming, and you have to do your due diligence. The law tells us exactly what we have to do. So that's a very important part of their jobs, and each one of the school family liaison counselors, one of them in every building, is that anti-bullying specialist and charged with that.
Dr. Gleason?
Yes.
Can I just ask you real quickly, at the high school level, where it talks about classroom lessons focusing on mental health, is that happening through the health education classes?
Let me just find where you are, Christine.
Yeah, it's just the last line for the, what they're doing at the high school level. I'm just curious at what is that part of the health education?
So it's part of health education, number one, but they're also doing the Lifelines lessons also, which are part of the, I believe, 11th grade and 9th grade curriculum, which is a very structured curriculum, and it requires a co-taught model with the counselor as well as the health teacher. And then they also do their classroom lessons as well as part of health. They also run a lot of groups, and a lot of individual counseling.
Ralph, I would like to recommend that in some capacity, we get a report on the complete view of this district-wide. Caseload, reports, number of HIBs, total, anything that could be valuable to assess where we're at, because this is not going to change for next year's budget. There'll be more. And
Probably go up.
to Lisa's point, my concern is we can hire 100 people to be reactive. Where are we putting assets to be proactive as best we can, knowing that a lot of it's out of our hands and comes from social and familial backgrounds and biological or whatever it may be. But we need to be as proactive as we do reactive. So I don't have a sense right now that I think I could vote for these two in isolation for this year's budget without having a better picture of the complete school liaison program, caseload, expectations, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I would ask if we could see something like that. That would be helpful to me.
And it's got to be very, very confidential, because you don't want to scare people away.
Of course.
That information is so sensitive.
Yes, it is. The other piece of that is, we have students, especially as they get older, moving into middle school and certainly high school, we see a lot more cases of school phobia and anxiety, and students who are having difficulty returning to school, being home for a period of time, home instruction, which the district pays for, and then having a really difficult time coming back into school. And I think that we've certainly, in working with some of our facilitators for RTI, they've talked to us about that at the high school level. How do we bring more kids back that have been home for a while? They need more support in school, and that's the counselor. If they're not special education, that's the counselor, and in some cases the counselor, and possibly also caseworker. So I think there's another area that we could improve, bringing some students back to school that we may not have been able to. Okay, I'm going to move on. The next position we discussed last week, this was at Allenwood School, and this is the need for an additional ICR teacher, in-class support teacher. And this is the principal's rationale over here. She's moving an ICR teacher to grade 4 next year because of the increase in classified students. That will leave us without another supported section in grade 3. So our current second grades, we've had an increase in the number of classified students. We need to increase a section. We need to have another section to split those students and have another ICR teacher to be able to do that. So
Is there enough classrooms in the school for that?
that teacher would go into a current section right
okay.
now, but I am going to talk about that enrollment number going up to 3rd grade, because we also have another issue in 3rd grade that we'll have to talk about. Regardless of that, we still need the additional ICR teacher. But I will talk about some of the enrollment needs as well. Any questions on the special ed ICR teacher? Okay, on the following page, at intermediate school, I did bring this last week as well, from the intermediate staff. We have students coming up from the elementary school that will be going into what's a combination of LLD, ABA, which is learning language disabled, and applied behavioral analysis. So it's students with several disabilities, and they have 4 students coming up. And some of the students in that class go out and are mainstreamed, but the students who will be coming up will likely not be mainstreamed, so we're going to need additional staff. When the students are mainstreamed, we don't need as much staff, but we will need 1 additional special ed teacher at intermediate school for that program.
So, question with this one is that if we didn't have this teacher, we would have to pay to send the student out.
I don't know about that, but I mean, that potentially. We also have in that program 2 tuition-in students, so there will be some offset of cost that it's already happening, that will be happening, that they're coming up. So we have some tuition in
So, I mean, it
on
would
2 of
kinda
those students.
almost make sense that if we have 2 students tuition, then if we didn't have this position, chances are we probably would have to offer those services to another district.
Correct, if
Yeah.
the program is not sufficing what their needs are and we don't have the correct staffing, yes, we could
Okay.
potentially lose that revenue as well. Okay, the next 2 items, you'll see that basically they are a wash. We have 1 fifth grade teacher. Based on projected enrollment for 5th grade, we had 4 sections. It looks like we're going to only need 3 sections for next year. I'm sorry, I'm not talking to the mic. We're only going to need 3 sections. So in one sense, we lose or abolish that position, but we need to maintain that position. It would be a new position for special ed in-class resource. And at Old Mill, they've had a configuration in their LLD class that they need to reconfigure because an increase. So this teacher will really kind of be split between a few grade levels and provide in-class support between grades 1 through 4. I haven't seen the schedule. It'll take a while to do that schedule at the building level, but there's multiple needs that teacher would be going in depending on which class the student will come out of and go into to be mainstreamed. That teacher will follow for in-class resource. So that is the addition there, but again, that's a wash. We'll be losing 1 and adding 1. Any questions on that position? The next position is a dispatcher trainer for transportation. I believe, Brian, you talked a little bit about this position last week. Do you want to provide any more details on that position?
Only to add that we used to have the position in the district. The position was abolished due to budgetary constraints, and because we were looking to relocate the student transportation, but we found that we definitely have the need. We only have 2 individuals in that office, trying to handle phones, trying to handle the radios with the drivers. It's very difficult, as well as trying to manage the department while you're dealing with phones and the radio all day. In addition, we would like to provide additional training for our bus drivers, and whether that be provided as part of this position, that may be dependent on the individual that's hired, or it'll provide the availability for the transportation manager or assistant manager to actually get out of the office and provide the training to potential drivers or candidates for become bus drivers, as well as our bus drivers on an ongoing basis.
So when we hire bus drivers, I mean, they're already certified with CDL to drive buses, correct, or no?
Not necessarily.
So
We're
why,
kind of like Marshall, we'll take anybody.
It's extremely hard to find right now. You
Yeah,
can't
bus
find
drivers are very
certified
difficult to
people
find, so if you want to be a bus driver in Wall Township, we will spend the time, and we'll take you out on a bus, and we'll train you how to be this is for the public, we'll bring you out on a bus, and we'll train you how to be a bus driver so that you could take the driver's test and obtain your CDL, so that you could become a bus driver in Wall Township. And that is, and it's not that easy of a driver's test, and you also have to be knowledgeable, and the new requirements are you need to check. No, That's, no. No, they're not. Yeah, we give them a year.
Get that on the record, please, clearly.
No, you can apply for the position. We'll train you to obtain your CDL prior to hiring you. How's that?
Okay, any other questions on dispatcher trainer? Okay, the next two positions, last week, we had a discussion, Erin, I know you had brought up about some concerns around class size. And so we have an analysis of, this is at the elementary only, analysis of the 4 elementary schools. And we have, the board has a policy on class size, and policy 2312, and it has our preferred minimums and our preferred maximums. And so, just to take 2 schools off the table, in Central School, we did have a bubble this year in kindergarten. We had 101 students, which is, we have not had in a while, so that's a bubble. We don't anticipate having those numbers coming in kindergarten again. The timeliness of having the demographers report, we were also able to have some good data to base our projected enrollment for kindergarten rather than just trends. So we should be fine in speaking to the principal. The numbers look good. Our, average class sizes are all within those preferred minimums and maximums at Central School. So we're okay there. At Old Mill, again, same thing. We're running about 3 sections at every grade level. We do have to kind of keep our eye on next year's first grade, our rising first graders. They're at 21.3 right now with a preferred maximum of 22, but we're still within our class size. Where we're seeing some concerns are at Allenwood and at West Belmar, so I just wanted to go over those 2 with you. The first being Allenwood. Our current second graders, rising third graders. We have 3 sections right now. Now, keep in mind, this is our school that houses our BD and MD classes self-contained. So we have students who may be self-contained throughout the day, but then also come back into those classes. So they don't count in the roster count, but they also might come in for part of the day, sometimes for ELA, sometimes for math, sometimes for both. So the average class size right now for our current second grade, rising third grader, is 24.3, and all 3 sections are at that number. And in fact, in that particular class, we have 2 students who come in for part of the day and 1 student for a larger part of the day, which would make one of those classes at 25, if not 26, outside of our preferred max of 24. So, that's a concern. That's also the same grade level that we have an increase in the number of students that are classified and where the principal is asking for the additional in-class resource teacher. So we're looking for a 4th section of what would be next year's third grade, and then also that additional position for ICR so that there would be 2 ICR classes. Now, the next question is, where would we put that class? Because we're at, with the exception of West Belmar, we're really at our max in all the buildings. But we do have a computer lab that the principal we talked about that could be refurbished as a classroom. And the principal is supportive of that idea because, as you know, we're using our traditional stationary computer labs less and less because students have one-to-one. Or teachers have Chromebook carts, and so technology teachers can almost be more in that, in the classroom, kind of a coaching model, but in the classroom pushing in more. And so that would be the only space that would be available at that school, and the principal feels that that would be an appropriate space. It would take a little bit of work to, outfit it correctly, but it would be an appropriate space, and it would bring our class size down to, I believe, around 18 for rising third grade. Any questions there?
Sounds like a plan.
Well, that we'd have to work with, facilities and see, to make sure that there's equity in we're talking desks, we're talking, obviously, there's plenty of technology,
The only reason I'm
whiteboards.
asking that is because you want the teacher and the classroom at the same time.
I don't anticipate, I mean, I couldn't give you a hard number right now, Ken. We'd have to sit down and go through to match that classroom to the other third grade classrooms. And then, of course, we'd have to outfit that with curricular resources as well.
But it might not necessarily be a third grade classroom. It could be, you know, a different grade shifting in there if it made sense in the building, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be that class in
Right.
there. You're absolutely right. But we do need an additional classroom.
Dr. Gleason, the
Yes.
Allenwood, three sections in second grade with the 24, I get all that. The additional next year will make it 18. What does the first grade look like currently?
The current first grade,
Is this a trend of hiring another teacher, you know, next year for the next grade, so to speak, too?
okay, our current first grade, which is are you talking about next year's first grade or our current first grade going to second grade?
Current to first to second. yeah.
Okay, so our current first grade right now is 50, hang on, let me read this over, because that's next year's. So
53.
50, no, that's
That's
next year, so this is actually our second grade. That will be next year's second grade. So we have 71 currently in our first grade class, that's next year rising, right? And our class size is at 22, so we're right at preferred maximum for rising second grade. We don't have anyone over that right now, according to the numbers that the principal provided me.
And so there's 3 sections of that currently?
There are 3 sections of that,
And
correct.
without any changes, you anticipate it stays at 3 for
I
next year?
I don't have any recommendations from the principal here, and as I said, I don't have any numbers that show over that. Now, also, remember that what we've been doing, because our policy, the board policy for class size, is that when we go beyond that preferred maximum, that we can also assign an instructional aide or an instructional para in that classroom for support for the teacher. So we've done that in certain cases rather than hiring a teacher, but you know, in the case of third grade where you're over already in pretty much every class and you're having kids coming out of the special ed classrooms and into those classrooms, you'd have to put paras in every one of those sections, and at that point, it doesn't make sense to do that.
Understood. And the West Belmar, you expect 2 sections of the kindergarten, did you say?
So
Next
West,
year?
yeah, so
Or if
West
I-
Belmar.
If I
what-
missed that, I'm sorry.
West Belmar, what we have right now, we currently have 2 sections of kindergarten that will move up to first grade. There's currently only 1 section of first grade and 1 first grade teacher, okay? So we could have one of those teachers loop up or move up with the kindergarten class, which would suffice the second grade classroom, okay? Where I see a concern, let me show you 2. The one that currently exists. The current first grade, right now, this year's current first grade has 24 students. That's 2 over the preferred maximum. Now, that class is also an in-class resource, so there's a second certified teacher in there. They do have a co-teaching model, so they're co-teaching, so the student-teacher ratio is, you know, one could say it's, you know, 12-1. And then there's also a paraprofessional. Now, the paraprofessional is in there for specific students and not for the whole class. There's only 1 section, so I don't know that I would recommend splitting that into 2 sections of 12 and adding a teacher there when it's only 1 section, and they seem to be doing well right now. Where my bigger concern lies is in kindergarten, keeping an eye on kindergarten. We don't have all the registrations in right now, but in looking at the demographer's report, they projected 25 for kindergarten for next year in West Belmar. And looking at past trends, we had roughly 22 in there. So both of those numbers are over the preferred maximum at kindergarten. So, you know, again, you'll be splitting classes into smaller classes for kindergarten, but I think we have to really keep our eye on that grade level at West Belmar.
But
Dr.
generally,
Gle-
the kindergarten class, is it better to have a smaller size if needed?
The numbers always are, the younger, the smaller the class size, which is why our preferred minimums go from 21 up to 24. Joe, I'm sorry.
Have you noticed, from year to year, like, is there any kind of historical data on kindergarten enrollment from kindergarten to first grade? Because it's been my experience, at least people that I know or whatever, is my, my youngest went to St. Catherine's. And so they don't offer full day. So what I noticed was a lot of people would send their kids to kindergarten at Wall for the full day kindergarten, and then go to St. Rose or St. Catherine. So I'm wondering what the numbers were from all four elementary schools on any given year, if you added them all up, to see how many of the retention rate would come back, to see how many you lose. So if
You know,
that's a
I can
noticeable
find
thing,
that for you.
it may be, may only be 3 or 4 or 5, but that may be the difference between, a class bumping up against your number versus, and again, of course, it doesn't account for any new families that move in, and that's always a fluctuating moving target. But I just didn't know whether you guys always noticed that you get these people that come in and they're only in the district 1 year, and they're there, and you're like, oh, where'd they go? And they didn't move, but they found a different school.
I think that you're absolutely right with that whole kindergarten full-day piece in private or in parochial school. I don't see any startling drop-offs in first grade, but we have the demographers report. I was going to bring that binder, and I didn't bring it. And we actually have that tracked back for the last, I could look back over a 5-year period. But we did those kindergarten trends based upon that. And so, and that's outside of the demographers report. So I don't see any major drop-offs. The other thing is that West Belmar historically has a little bit more mobility in its population. So sometimes we'll have what we think is going to be 22, and then 2 days before school starts, 4 more kids show up, and then we could, a few months later, have some kids leave. It's really hard to put a number on that, but we're using past trends and the demographers report. But I do think that we have to keep an eye on it with kindergarten.
Well, the trend we used to see prior to offering full-day kindergarten is that students would come to our district in first, second, third grade, because they would go to the private or parochial for the kindergarten. But since we moved to full-day kindergarten, we see them earlier and staying. Although it would be interesting to see if the trend is going the other way now. With
I don't think it would be significant, but again, when you're Dr. Gleason is talking about 1 or 2 kids over a threshold, preferred number, it only takes a couple kids to change that. And
Right.
so if you're talking about in North Wall, you get a couple kids go to St. Rose, and South Wall, you get a couple kids go to St. Catherine's, or vice versa. You could be talking 5 or 6 kids in kindergarten that are now going to go to a parochial school. Well, there's 1.3 off her numbers for a class size in one of the schools.
I think the other thing to also to consider, especially when you're comparing 2 scenarios, Allenwood and West Belmar. Allenwood, it's 3 sections that you're dealing with high numbers, and to provide, according to the policy, that assistance, whether it be a co-teacher or a paraprofessional, you're doing it in 3 classrooms, where if you split it into 4, your numbers are going from 24, 25 to 18, which is still a reasonable number. When you only have 1 section of 24, 25, it's more cost-effective to provide the assistance within that 1 class as opposed to splitting it and going down to 12 students per class. When you're trying to provide some equity among the schools in the district, that's kind of moving in the opposite direction of that.
So we could look at potentially 2 scenarios there as we watch the enrollment, as we get closer to the school year. We could look at if it's really just sort of right at that tipping point. Are we looking at a paraprofessional to support the classroom because it is only 1 section, or are we looking at another full-time teacher to split into 2 smaller sections? So we have a little bit more flexibility there as opposed to Allenwood, where
And if you include
it's more efficient.
the position in the budget, and it's determined that it's not necessary, we would end up using those funds to fund the other positions that we're not hiring at step 1, that we budgeted at step 1. So that's where the funds would come from.
Dr. Gleason, are those numbers published somewhere? Our
The enrollment
preferences?
numbers,
Just our preferences, like at what grade level, what are maximums and
yes,
our
they're in
minimums?
our district policy, thank you, 2312 is our.
They're
dis-
not actual, there's no numbers included in that.
Is it in the
Oh, it's
regulation?
in the regulation, I'm sorry,
Okay,
Christine, you have to
thank
go to the
you.
regulation, I apologize.
Thanks.
I have a question. Are we anticipating any positions to be absorbed or after retirement?
So I did do an analysis across the grade levels to see if we could collapse any sections and move, potentially have a teacher transfer from another school, but we're really right there, which is, one of the reasons why we're talking about, reconfiguration and are we at max capacity? We don't have in any other school a grade level where if we were to collapse a section, we'd still be under that minimum size. We'd just be creating the same scenario there. So that would have been, ideal to be able to find one school that we could do that in one grade level, but it doesn't exist under the current enrollment.
Doctor, so you're saying there's no ability at West Belmar to move up a kindergarten teacher next year? Because you're expecting the need to have 2 currently.
Right, the 2 kindergarten sections we have right now, as they move to first grade, we'll need to move one of those teachers up, because there's currently a teacher at first grade, but one of them will have to move up, because there's, what did I say, 20?
Right, okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
And then absorption is one way. Are there any, positions that we've added in the last 2 or 3 years that are not being fulfilled adequately or working out that we found that we don't need, or numbers didn't add up, or we can consolidate in some capacity there that we've looked at?
Well, it's certainly something we can look at in terms of an analysis of all positions. I did take a look at the elementary level, our ESL teachers are absolutely needed in our Magnet ESL school. We have G&T teachers that, we have a full-time G&T teacher who's just meeting the regulations for servicing students identified for G&T. And then the other G&T teacher for K2 is a .6 teacher. We've met to discuss ways that she can see more kids. She's meeting the regulations. We can provide whole class enrichment so she can go into full classes, but I think that we could improve that area. So I don't know that that's an area that we'd want to sort of right size. The only other option, not the only other option, but one other option is you continue to move up and you look at the intermediate and you see, are there any sections there that aren't running, any programs that are not at capacity? And do you have elementary teachers that have an elementary cert that would want to move down to elementary? Those are conversations that we can continue to have with administrators, but it would have to be an additional conversation for sure. The first place, as I said, I started was working directly within the elementary school.
Just because I am not familiar with the policy or the regulation that you just referenced, preferred max being 24 at some levels. Once it hits that number, the policy says we hire somebody immediately, or is there a time frame for that preferred max to linger? Because it is a preferred max, not a legal max. I understand it. I'm not saying we want to stretch that too long, but where do we have flexibility within the budget to manage that so we're, as soon as it hits the number, it triggers a hire or whatever the case may be? What does the policy say about that?
There is a legal max for kindergarten. It's in code that we can't have more than, I believe it's 25 in kindergarten. But our policy reads that when the number of students assigned to a class exceeds the maximum preferred, the following actions may be taken. So consideration given to an assigning an instructional aide to assist the teacher, classes organized into team teaching components, which we've done that at the upper grades, or the principal reorganizing the grade level into a greater number of classes, which is adding another section. It doesn't speak to timeline, but of course we would want to do that sooner rather than later, so that kids aren't suffering from any loss of instructional time.
Understood. And Brian, my only other question for you is, could we get an analysis of the last 2 budget cycles? How many new hires were added in the last year separately? Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I think that was it on new staff proposals. Thank you. You're welcome.
Unless there's any objection, we can go for 3 hours. so that you can take a look at it and understand it. We can discuss it some more next week. But it's a school bus replacement schedule, and it's what we've been using in trying to, maintain a relatively flat line item in the budget with regard to where we lease purchase our school buses. We've applied for the grants, grant each year that offers $20,000 per bus in the replacement of those buses. And we're just trying to, maintain a level, a fleet, in order to, to service our population, and again, with trying to keep the line account somewhat flat. So in looking at this, you got the years down the left-hand side. The first column of on hand, that would be the number of buses we have at the beginning of the of our budget year, or over the summer, and then if any buses we purchased would be in that first purchase column. And then on hand in the middle is pretty much the number of buses we had throughout the school year. So that's what we operated with. And then after the year ends, we will retire buses because we can use buses for like a conventional style bus for 15 years, the transit style or flat nose for 20 years, but we'll be required to retire them. That's at the end of the year. So then at the end of the year, that we have the number of buses that are on hand, which carries over to the next year, the beginning of the next year, and then just carries through how many we purchased, how many we had on hand during the school year. So we've been reducing the number of buses, and we do one of two things. If we had the buses on hand, we look to bring back contracts that we were contracting out, or routes that we were contracting out. If we had the ability to perform them in-house, we would, as long as we could package them together for a full day for our driver, so that they're just not doing perhaps 1/3 of a day. And again, I don't want to go into any detail, but one, it's trying to keep the line account somewhat flat, so there's not too much of a fluctuation because we're trying to absorb it within the 2%. And trying to keep a consistent number of buses on hand. And if you could see, looking forward to, the end of 23-24, we're going to be retiring 10 buses. So we're, over the next few years, we're retiring 3, 2, then 5 in 2020, 22-23, and then 10 the end of 23-24. So, and that's a combination of buses that were bought that had a lifespan of 15 years, and buses that were bought 5 years earlier that had the 20-year lifespan. They just happen to both be coming at the same time, because they changed the life of a conventional bus from 12 years to 15 years a number of years back. So that's why, there's some drastic numbers, coming up. So we're trying to keep it relatively flat, and the same applies for the vans. So, but I can talk more of it next week. And then I didn't know.
Brian, can I just ask a quick question about busing? Not that we want to become a for-profit kind of entity, but is there an opportunity for us as a bigger district to make any more revenue by being a bus provider for those who don't provide their own? Or are we kind of maxed out with that?
We're somewhat maxed out with our regular routes. We do provide additional trips for them. We do field trips and athletic trips when we are contacted by the local, typically the K-8 districts that are surrounding us.
Can we do it cheaper than a private bus company
Yes.
and still make it revenue positive?
Based on the estimates we provide on it, yes, we try to make it revenue positive, and we also provide it as, not to say that it's goodwill, but it's as assistance to another public entity.
So if we, just out of curiosity, if we had 2 more buses or 3 more buses, could we make a significant amount of money that could offset a maintenance fund or anything like that, or is it an insignificant amount of money?
It would be, in that scheme of things, insignificant. Where the additional buses, having additional buses on hand, benefits the district in that we don't have to, we have less of a need to contract out for athletics, especially in the busy seasons, and we have very successful teams that run through late in the fall. But in the fall and spring especially, we'll have every one of our spares out in an afternoon, and that avoids us having to contract out at some crazy costs that they're charging because of the shortage.
But
of
the wear and
drivers.
tear is, you're adding 10,000 more miles per bus potentially, or whatever it might add up to be.
Yeah.
So their
doing the
lifespan
athletics.
gets,
The issue is getting
accelerated.
drivers, is where the hardship is. And, you know, sometimes getting the athletic drivers because they're only working, you know, extra runs. It's not a full-time route. So. Was there any questions that anybody had on the budget details report?
A question related to the buses. I saw recently, and I know it's cutting-edge technology, but maybe the School Boards Association had something about electric buses. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but again, I don't know what that technology is just yet, but there was some information about the state having some assistance with that. And I'm only thinking about that in terms of, you know, gas cost and that kind of thing as the technology improves as a cost saving.
That would be something I'd be more than happy to look into. We looked into in the
find it, I'll
past
send it to
propane
you.
buses, natural gas buses. We have New Jersey
And this
Natural
was
Gas right on
electric, I'm
Route
sure of
34. I'd be a little surprised with electric
Yeah,
school
well,
bus.
probably the vans and not really the buses.
Okay.
So,
What we
but
have
I'll
moved
send
to
that link
is
to you.
we've moved away from diesel buses and we're moving to or regular gasoline buses. And they run cleaner, quieter, and they're less maintenance.
And then
requirement.
another thought I had with regards to that, it's the mention of athletics and how many of those trips are necessitated because we can't field the events here, again, due to facilities issues. I'm thinking of the track and field team. You know, that's something that we have to all think about too. What other sports are being forced to be bussed out, whereas we're incurring a higher cost for transportation because of that.
Well, and we also, although we would have that cost if it was in-house, we agree to pay the official fees when.
Well, it's not the same as running a bus.
Oh, no, absolutely not. But that's an additional cost for not hosting the events
Officials, I
at
know
our
what they make,
location.
it's not the cost of a bus.
But the only events we're not hosting would be track right now, correct? I mean,
Yes,
but.
to my knowledge.
Right, and but we
Leave that to
also,
Mr. Redu.
we also use busing to transport students from the high school to the fields on 18th Avenue.
Correct.
So that, I mean, not having those sports teams play on campus and off campus, that's an additional cost unless you somehow figured out a way to move all the fields over, which wouldn't be possible. Pretty much. You don't have to answer.
Put in no.
Go ahead, Chris.
Last year we had grants. Are there any grants this year for the buses?
We made application for the grants, but we've not been notified.
Is there still a time frame where we might be notified?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
it's still open. That would be 2 years in a row. I'd be surprised. I'll be happy. But last year, we received a grant. It was $100,000, and we used it for 5 buses. And then it was a couple years prior to that we received a grant also. So,
Brian, the ads on buses don't add up to anything, true or false?
I don't know. In all honesty, I don't know what districts get. I have to tell you, personally, I'm really against them. You know, school buses should be yellow, and I want people looking at, you know, the kids walking in front of the schools, not the ads next to the school bus.
Understood.
I'd hate to have somebody distracted, and because they were looking at, and they have them in my town, and I see them, and I cringe. But if we'd want to investigate that as a revenue source, you know, we can.
I was just, I don't agree with them either, I was just curious.
As a revenue source, our football field with the banners and everything, is that revenue we bring in, or is that the foundation?
That would be the foundation.
No, it's not the Booster Club then.
We had this
No.
conversation about the advertisements in the buses. For
Yeah, we
hours,
switched the policy, right, for that?
for hours. And the distractions and the liabilities and everything else that goes on. I don't think you could, somebody's gonna get disturbed. I don't care what it is.
Then there's a whole nother story about what companies are, do you want on there, and are they children-focused, and what are
Right,
they selling, and,
I also
it becomes a
think
complex issue for an extra, what? That's what I was curious,
Probably
what
nothing.
districts are making out on it.
It's a safety issue. I mean, people go flying by school buses now with the red lights on and everything else. Can you imagine if somebody's driving along and they're looking at an ad? I mean, I think that would just be a disaster. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to ask?
I have
Yes.
one thing because it's time sensitive, and that is the CKF or Crimson Knight Foundation. It's coming up on March 26th, so make sure you go out and get your tickets and support the foundation, which in turn supports the school. And it's all parents and other community members who are trying to assist us with that wonderful event. I'll be there.
And again, if anyone has questions and they want to either come in and go through the budget reports, I have absolutely no problem with that. If you're more comfortable sending emails or a phone call, see lots of sticky notes over there. Hey, which is great. And you know what? It probably is not going to be as involved as you think. We probably, rifle through them and, for the most part, hopefully address all of them.
2 or 3 hours.
I will spare you the Post-it notes.
Motion to adjourn?
Okay.
Anything else? No? Motion to adjourn?
I'll make
So
the
moved.
motion.
Second?
Yes,
All right. All in favor?
All right.
yes.
Thank you. Have a good night.